All right.
Very
Hi,
cool.
Garrett.
Hello.
How's it going?
Good. Yeah, how are you?
Good. Can I call you Dr. Garrett now?
No, so I don't know if this is a little bit misleading, but I don't actually have my PhD. I just have my master's.
Yeah, Master Garrett.
Master Garrett. That still feels weird. I don't know if there's not really a good title for a master's degree holder.
Sure.
I've had people ask like, oh, what do I call you now? Because my PhD lab mates, they got their PhD, so we call them Dr. Vogleg, Dr. Garfinkel, but it's like, oh, Garrett, what do we call you now? It's like, I'm still Garrett, I guess. There's no good title for a master's degree holder, but yeah, so I'm still just Garret Jolma,
Cool.
MS.
Cool. Yeah, absolutely. Did you go to the graduation this weekend?
Yeah.
You see that?
So, because there's like the big ceremony, and then each department has its own little ceremony. So the museum had its own graduation ceremony as well. So I went to both. The big one was I think the headline that CU Boulder put out was that it was a soggy and celebratory occasion, that was about right.
Oh yeah,
it was very soggy.
Yeah, so we went to the one yesterday, and granted it held out, but for the past 2 days though, it was just raining down, and folks were walking around in their high heels and they're just getting drenched the whole time before getting in. So yeah, fortunate yesterday was good.
Yeah. We had to gather on Norland Quad right before the big celebration, the campus-wide celebration. And some of my fellow museum studies people, their heels were sinking into the quad, and I just felt so bad for them. Yeah.
Why did you decide to come out to Boulder?
Well, so yeah, for context, I went to the Museum and Field Studies program here at CU Boulder, which, if I do say so myself, is one of the best museum studies programs in the nation, especially if you're going into natural history. There's some others that specialize in art history or history, but in terms of natural history, this is one of the best. But originally I went here because I basically chose my advisor first. But that's a whole long story. I don't know if you want me to just go ahead and start into it. Because,
go for it. I think it's all good.
I knew I'd wanted to go to grad school, but it's the tricky thing where you really have to choose an advisor first instead of a program first. That's usually how it goes, not always, but that was the case for me. I was trying to find biology researchers who used museum collections in their research.
Okay.
That's what I wanted. And I found a couple people, and some people had pointed me to Colorado to study with Dr. Dean Bowers because she uses collections in her research. But midway through that process, I finally realized I don't just want a biology researcher as my advisor who uses museum collections in their research. I realized I just wanted to work in a museum.
Okay.
So even midway through the process, I was like, wait, CU Boulder has a museum studies program. What am I doing? I'll just do that. And so that's where it started. So
cool. So are you still looking into museum studies or going into the field of museum proctoring? Is that right?
So there's a couple different things I could do with this specific degree in the museum field. People usually think of a museum curator. That's the most well-known job. Usually that's a position that will require a PhD, but it's just as well because usually a curator is also the person who does the administrative stuff. Okay. And I'm not down for that. So, but just with an MS, I could be, and this is what I would like to do, is to be a collections manager. So to be the person who looks after the museum collections, makes sure that they're okay, that, when the researchers come to use those collections, that they're being handled properly, all that sort of stuff. But there's a couple other kinds of roles in the museum. People need, not only administrators, but they need financial people, they need educators, they need, there's all sorts of stuff. So I would like to be a collections manager, but I'm open to sort of other roles in the museum world.
Yeah. And so there's so many hands in the museum. Do you prefer more field work then to go out and sort of, be in the wild and make your collections and all that?
Because I've done both. I've done work sort of in the collection in the museum, and I have also been in the field. They're both so much fun. I don't know if I had to pick one though, I would say to be the sort of indoorsy collections manager is fine with me. But even so, like collections managers are occasionally called on to do collections of their own. So if that happens, like perfect, I'd be happy with that.
Okay. So were you always into like bugs and insects and outdoors?
I've been into insects for a very long time. So I grew up in rural Montana.
Okay.
And 4-H is like very big there. So
4-H.
Yeah, 4-H is like an extracurricular organization for kids. It kind of helps with their leadership skills and public speaking skills and all the rest. And so these kids will pick a project that they'll do throughout the course of the year, and then they'll present that project at the fair in the summer. And most kids in rural Montana, their project would be like their sheep or their cow or their animal, which they would show at the fair. I chose entomology, so that was one of the 4-H projects that you could pick was entomology, and I just thought that was such a weird and cool project. I was like, oh, I want to do that. And so that was like third grade when I really got interested in insects for the first time. And so I did 4-H entomology all the way through, by the time I graduated high school. So by that point I knew like, this is great. I want to keep doing more, learning more about insects and doing more research on insects and all the rest. And so then I got my undergrad in biology and master's degree in museum studies, where I got to work in the entomology collection here on campus. So I've been interested in insects for a really long time now.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, I just remember as a kid just going out and playing with all kinds of insects and ants and grasshoppers and some of us would like collect them, and then like at night there would be like fireflies and we'd go catch them in a jar and kind of watch that sparkle there.
Because did you grow up in Michigan?
Michigan,
correct? And they have fireflies. Okay, so that's the one thing I've always been jealous of is the fireflies in the Midwest, because I again grew up in Montana out, and they don't have fireflies out west, and so always in the cartoons and shows and stuff they would show kids like catching fireflies and keeping them in the jar, and I always thought like, well, that's amazing, but like some corner of my mind I was like, is that not like made up? That seems way too cool to be true. But it's like, no, they just have fireflies in Michigan. That's crazy.
So for you specifically, it was more of the program there, the 4-H program, that got you into it, or were you more just like go on your own accord and kind of like seek to study on your own time?
Oh, I see what you mean. Well, so again, where I grew up, it was middle and very rural, but that meant that I was always very close to the natural world. And so I was interested in all sorts of things, including like fossils. So in central Montana, there's a couple different rock formations where they will dig up like tyrannosaurs and triceratops and stuff just on a regular basis. So I was always been interested in dinosaurs and paleontology, and then astronomy, because you're so far away from any major city lights that you can go out at night and just see everything. It was always incredible. But then all sorts of animals just always around the house. And so insects are sort of the easiest ones to study because they're just everywhere. They're ubiquitous and small, and so you don't need a lot of equipment or a lot of food or whatever else to like study them. And so that sort of underlying interest in the natural world had always been there. But really what had happened was after my first year of 4-H, I went to the fair and saw an older 4-H member's insect collection. So the very first year when I was in 4-H, I wasn't in entomology because I didn't know that was a thing. But when I went to the fair, I saw an older member's insect collection, and I thought that was the coolest thing ever, and that I wanted to do that exact thing. And so it was my second year of 4-H is when I got interested in entomology and really started that project.
Okay.
So the underlying interest was there. All it took was to realize that this was a thing that people do. People collect insects, and you can show them at the fair in 4-H. And so to realize that was a valid path, that was sort of the inciting incident.
Now, when you collect these insects, you obviously wouldn't want to showcase them alive, right? And so obviously when you do showcase them, like what is the process like to fully embalm or keep them preserved in such a way?
Yeah. Okay. So there's the process that maybe a professional insect collection would use, like on campus. But then there's also which is actually very similar to the process that I would use when I was a kid, which is simply to collect them live, and then make sure that all the collection information is there. So an insect without any collection information is basically useless. Mm-hmm. So you have to make sure that once you've collected your insect, okay, where did you find it? Was it on a plant? Was it on the car? Where exactly was it? Was it near town? Was it out in the boonies? In which county, date and time. And so all that information needs to be recorded along with your insect. But I would usually catch it like in a pill bottle or some other little container, and then bring it home and freeze it. So freezing insects is the most humane way to kill them.
Freezing.
Freezing.
Okay.
It's because they are cold-blooded organisms.
Mm-hmm.
So basically they just, their metabolism slows down when they get cold, and they just kind of go to sleep and don't wake up.
Okay.
And so that's kind of gnarly to think about, but it's a lot better than, the alternatives would be to put them in a killing jar. That's literally what it's called. It's a killing jar.
Huh.
It's a jar filled with like ethyl acetate or some other chemical to basically suffocate the insect. Mm-hmm. So that's quicker, but I don't really like dispatching my insects that way. So usually I would just freeze them in the family freezer at home, which my parents are very generous. They understood that's what I was using it for, and they were okay with having bugs in the freezer, in the kitchen freezer. So that's what I do. And then basically if the insect, so then you take it out of the freezer, and if the insect can dry out enough, then that's all the preservation it really needs. So At that point, you just put an insect pin through the insect to like keep it stable, and then that's it. And then you put it in a display case, and fingers crossed, that's all you need to do. Now sometimes, like, this is what happened when I was, by the time I was a teenager, building my own collection, I had collected a few insects that were very large, like a lubber grasshopper or giant water bug, or things that actually were kind of large, and that meant that they didn't dry out all the way. And so either they would, it's kind of gross, but either they would like start to rot, or the smell would start to attract other kinds of insects called dermestid beetles. Mm-hmm. And then if they could get into my display case, they would eat my like pinned insect specimens.
Oh.
So which is no good. And so I found out that, even if you have done everything correctly, there will be pests that will get into your insect collection and eat your insects. So at that point, there's kind of two things you can do. Either you can do what I did when I was a teenager, which is to put a mothball in the corner and kind of pin it in place. And so that's like a chemical way to kill the pests, the dermestid beetles. Or you can do what we do in a professional insect collection and just freeze the entire display case.
Okay.
And that will kill any pests that are in there, and then you should be good to go after that.
Huh.
But so that's kind of the whole process. And again, like, as much as you're managing the actual insect specimen itself, you also have to manage the information. So somewhere in there, after you've pinned the insect, you'll also make a label that has like, here's what I think it is, and here's where I found it, and here's all the details about that too.
Okay.
So it's about specimen management and information management.
Huh. So when you go to display and showcase them in a museum, let's say, is the temperature regulation like always on too? Like do you make sure that like these display cases are always frozen or like kept in some sort of chamber before you release them? Like, do they have like a duration? Maybe they are allowed to be out for a day, and then at night when everybody's gone, like they put these insects back into the freezer or something.
That would be amazing to have a system where you could freeze them every night. But usually if you're putting insects out on display, there will be a period of time where they're just out. Again, the display case, in the museum exhibit will have some protections so that pests can't get in. So for the most part, it should be protected. But those insect specimens can be taken out of their original drawers and put into the exhibit. And they'll be on exhibit for, depending on the exhibit, a few months at a time.
Mm-hmm.
But it would be ideal to have them in a sealed exhibit case so that pests can't get in. And somewhere that's temperature controlled. So not, you wouldn't want to freeze them every night. Even though that would keep pests away, if you froze and thawed them enough times, that would also cause like mechanical stress on the specimens.
Mm-hmm.
So really just kind of keep it at a constant temperature. Even room temperature is okay, but just keep it constant. And then preferably somewhere in low lighting. So a lot of museum exhibits, if you'll go in and it'll be kind of really dimmed lighting. Yeah. The rooms themselves will be dark. And part of that is for specimen care. Otherwise, if it was bright lights on the specimens, the whole time, the specimens would start to fade. And that's true for historical documents that are on display. That's true for insects. Their bright colors would start to fade. So there are some things you can do to conserve the specimens when they're on display. But then, usually when they're getting put back into the research collection, they'll get frozen one more time and then put back into the research collection.
Okay. So, wow. So it's like a lot of heavy equipment in the back, keeping everything at, good temperatures so everybody can hold their form.
A good museum building should have really effective HVAC systems to keep the rooms at similar temperatures. And most big museums will have their own walk-in freezers to freeze. Not only stuff that's coming off display or stuff that they found pests in the storage drawers, but even just storing specimens before they've been prepped.
Okay. Yeah, because I know that there's the museum on campus here. I didn't get a chance to visit it yet, but do they have good enough equipment for storage and just to hold their form?
Yeah, so, which again, I highly recommend that you go. This is the University of Colorado Museum of Natural History on campus. It's open every day. It's free to the public. Mm-hmm. So highly recommend you go. But what you'll see when you go to the public side is just, the public facing exhibits. We have an entire separate building called the Museum Collections Building that holds the research collections. That holds the entomology collection, the zoology collections, and the paleontology collection. Mm-hmm. So that building is the one that really holds the specimens most of the time whenever they're not on exhibit, and that's the building where it becomes crucially important to have similar temperatures the whole time. Make sure that the walk-in freezer is working. And at our museum, one of our favorite things to do is to complain about our building.
Okay.
And it's because it's an old building. The Museum Collections Building was built in 1910.
Okay.
And then we inherited it secondhand. So it was the geology building for years and years and years. And then we inherited it and it had to be retrofit to be a Museum Collections Building. And that was about 20 years ago. And so it's not the ideal collections building. It works great. But some of the rooms where the collections are held are better than others. The paleontology collection is in the basement, which means that the temperatures are kept fairly even across days and weeks and so on. But if there's ever heavy rains or if there's a leak in the building, the water will get funneled down to the basement. So that's not ideal.
Yeah.
But at the same time, in entomology, we're on the third floor, so we're up high, which theoretically gets us away from any floods. But because we're up high, that means in the summer it can get kind of warm. And so, there's costs and benefits to having this old building, and that's just kind of the way it is.
Yeah, that's fair. I mean, regardless, even having a museum on any campus is, quite the achievement there, and especially if it can, host a bunch of, animals or, lab studies. It's quite amazing to begin with. I would imagine the one in Denver
Museum of Nature and Science.
Nature and Science. Yeah, that's the one. That one, I'm sure it has equipped with much more than any campus would have, because that's their focus. That's their focus in Denver. And
yeah, so that building is super cool because it is a purpose-built building. Like, they're not getting anything secondhand.
Yeah.
And I did get to intern there last summer, about a year ago. And yeah, their collection space is incredible. They have a recent wing that was built 15 years ago now that is, purpose-built for collections. So it's all underground. It's all super climate controlled.
Mm-hmm.
It's incredible. And you would never know, though, just from going there as a visitor, because what you see as a visitor is like 3 floors of fantastic exhibits and displays and dioramas. But that collection space is sort of hidden from the public view. And so there might be a couple thousand specimens on display up in those exhibits, but there's like millions of specimens that are in the collection space underground.
Mm-hmm.
So you would never know as a visitor, but yeah, they have some incredible stuff at DMNS.
Okay. Yeah, you said you worked there last year, is that right?
Yeah, so as a part of the museum studies program here at CU Boulder, I had to do a 150-hour internship somewhere that wasn't our museum.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's actually pretty common for the natural history students to just go to Denver Museum of Nature and Science because they've got, it's close and they've got natural history collections.
Okay.
And so last year I got to go be an intern in the arachnology collection. So that's spiders and camel spiders and stuff like that.
Spiders. Okay.
Yeah, spiders. And the marine invertebrate collection, which ended up being just a lot of shells.
Mm-hmm.
So, that was last year. Super interesting to see how another museum does their stuff.
Was that something that you chose specifically to be part of the arachnology department there? And the marine department?
Okay, here's how it went. At CU Boulder here, we were processing this big influx of arthropod specimens that had been caught about 10 years ago, but we're just now processing them. And so arthropods includes insects and spiders and camel spiders and millipedes and all sorts of critters. And that one of those groups that we had been catching was camel spiders,
mm-hmm.
which aren't true spiders. They're related to spiders, but they look, if you ever Google camel spider, they look gnarly. They have 8 legs and they have big jaws, but they're not technically spiders.
Mm.
But it just so turns out that the curator of arachnology at DMNS is super interested in camel spiders. That's her focus. And so we had been sorting through all these camel spiders, and we'd been meaning to give them to, her name's Dr. Paula Cushing, the curator of arachnids at DMNS. And so last summer, I kind of struck a deal where I was like, hey, we have hundreds of these camel spiders that need to be housed somewhere where they'll get used and get researched. Would you like them? And of course she said yes, but then I also said, hey, in return, can I intern with you for the summer?
Yeah.
And now usually DMNS is very good about paying their interns. They have formal internships that are all paid, but it just so worked out that they didn't have an internship that summer for that section. But I told her, like, hey, I'll just, for a couple days a week, I'll come in. It'll be an unpaid internship, but it means I'll get my experience that I need for my program, and I can help do things around the arachnology collection. Yeah. And so that's how I got my foot in the door. And then, I gave her and her research crew all of these camel spiders, and I got to not only help with the arachnology collection, but then the marine invertebrate collection, which was a lot of shells from the Pacific.
Mm-hmm.
So
basically, it was her interest at Denver there that sort of can take students under her wing essentially, and then give them experience and get into the field that way. Yeah, it's not like a specific department that you would chose, but it's just something that's interesting that that caught your attention, and then you went in there and you're like, oh, I would like to learn more.
Yeah, and because DMNS does have an entomology section, so if I was trying to stick with just entomology, I could have done it that way. But I thought, okay, arachnology and marine invertebrates, they're still invertebrates. It's a close enough field to my own field of study that I would be knowledgeable in it, but it's still going to expand my horizons a little bit. So I figured that was a good sort of middle ground. And that, yeah, we had the specimens that needed a good home, and I knew they would get researched at the M&S.
Do you have a favorite insect or bug?
Oh, I don't know if I necessarily have a favorite. I do particularly like moths, so that's kind of my go-to answer. But otherwise, what I like to tell people is that I don't really have a favorite, but I do have kind of a short list of ones I'm familiar with. So when I was in undergrad, I did research on stick insects, and then in between undergrad and graduate school, I was a field technician for the USDA, and I surveyed grasshoppers, so I know a little bit about grasshoppers. And then for my thesis, I did a project about bees and wasps. So I've kind of sampled all sorts of different insect taxa, but I don't really know if I have a favorite yet.
I would imagine you like all of them essentially, right? But
more or less, yeah.
You mentioned bees and taxa for your project there. Was that sort of a project that came from yourself? Was that a project that was handed down from the professor in the department there?
It was kind of handed down. So how it worked is, and with master's projects, you really need to have a project that's ready to go. Whereas if you're a PhD, you can take a couple years to sort of feel out your research interests and figure out what you want to study and if it's feasible to study that and so on. But a master's program is so short that you really have to ask your advisors and the people around you, like, hey, do you have any projects ready to go? And figure out, which one you like the best or fits you the best. And so it just so happened that the project I was being offered included a project that had been done about 10 years ago called The Bee's Needs. The bees' needs. Yeah, so this was, what do the bees need? And it turns out they need housing, basically. They need places to nest. This was a citizen science or participatory science project that was started in 2013 and ran for 4 years, where the museum here on campus would hand out nesting blocks, which was, it's just a chunk of wood with holes drilled in it, to volunteers around the Front Range, and they would put them in their backyards. And these holes drilled in wood are great habitat for solitary bees and wasps. And so these bees and wasps would lay their eggs and make their nests in these tunnels that are drilled into these nesting blocks. And we would get data in return about who is nesting in these nesting blocks, which species, and what their nests look like, and so on. So that project ended in 2016, and they really didn't have the sort of bandwidth or the people power to analyze all that data that they produced. And so it had kind of been sitting dormant for a little bit. And so when I was here looking for projects to do, they had suggested, like, well, we've got all this data. It's ready to go. It just needs someone to analyze it. And I was drawn to it mostly because it was a participatory science project. Like, this is the culmination of, like, thousands of volunteers had gathered this data. And then it had been double checked by one of our professional scientists. But, this is a huge undertaking that they had done years ago. And so I thought that was particularly exciting. And so the bees part of it was almost incidental. Don't tell my committee that. But it was the citizen science, the participatory science part that appealed to me. And I ended up learning a little bit about bees and wasps along the way, just sort of as a nice side effect.
Yeah. Did you always start with bees and wasps when you started the program, or was it originally something else?
Oh, when I first got to the program here 2 years ago, there was a short list of projects I could have done. One of them included grasshoppers and crickets. And these grasshoppers and crickets have been collected along an elevational gradient. This is some of the work of my advisor, Dr. Christy McCain. And I could have analyzed, like, species distribution patterns along this elevation gradient. So which species are living where and why. I could have done that. I could have done a more museum-focused project about digitization protocols, about comparing different protocols across different institutions and which ones work the best and where there's room for improvements and efficiencies and stuff. And so I could have done that. But in the end, it was the citizen science project that appealed to me the most.
And also, was that like more in terms of feasibility to switch on? Was it more advantageous to switch over to bees just because there was more data and there was more sort of, you know, creativity involved that you can have with it?
Well, in terms of creativity, honestly, the most creative project probably would have been the project about digitization protocols, because it would have called on me to do a lot of research and call on different institutions and ask what their protocols are and do a lot of sort of synthesis and comparing of workflows. And, you know, I would have had to draw so many different diagrams to show the process of digitization. But in terms of feasibility, the Bees Needs project ended up being the most feasible in my mind, simply because the data was ready to go. I didn't have to do any data collection. I did, however, have to figure out how to analyze that much data, because there was something like 12,000 lines of data in this Excel spreadsheet that I was handed. And
again, the data wasn't collected by you, and you said there was already some pre-existing data. And then from what I remember from your talk there a couple weeks back, that it was public collected data. Is that right?
Yeah. So this project was, the bulk of the data collection was done by volunteer scientists. So these are people who just told the museum, hey, I'm interested in helping out with this project. I'm interested in bees and wasps. And they were given this nesting block that they put in their backyard, and then it was up to them to record the data. So they were given a workbook to sort of explain how to collect the data. But for the most part, it was these volunteers, unpaid, just in it for the interest of it, just because they want to do it, to collect this data every 2 weeks from April to October. And there were some like repeat volunteer scientists who did it for all 4 years. So they're just interested members of the public who wanted to learn more about bees and wasps and to help out the museum's project.
That's really cool how you like involve just the public to join in on a project, and it makes your project more dynamic, in that it's not just, you know, you're so isolated and siloed into your own data. Like you're including the public's hand in helping you collect the data there.
Participatory science is one of the best ways to do informal science education. Like, we're teaching the public about science by having them do it. And because they are doing that, that also means it's beneficial for us, because we get data collected across a huge geographic area by all these different people. And so it works both ways. I'm really a 2 thumbs up big fan of citizen science or participatory science or whatever you want to call it. I'm a big fan.
Yeah. So for these different collection from the public here, the data there, was it solely on like in the woods? Was it solely in like on campus or in people's yards?
So because it's volunteers asking for nesting blocks and wanting to be involved, it's really up to them as to where they place it. But what it ended up meaning was that most of the nesting blocks were put in people's backyards. Sort of suburban habitat. There were a few blocks that were put in open space areas here in Boulder County and sort of parks and stuff like that. But for the most part, it was people's backyards. It was a suburban habitat, which isn't a bad thing. With bees, there's some evidence that they might actually prefer suburban habitats, because it's this mix of areas to nest, like in people's homes and backyards and stuff. There's a lot of floral resources, like people's gardens that they'll put flowers into. And so to have a lot of data gathered just from suburban areas, that's not necessarily a bad thing. Yeah.
So in this case, it was more focused on suburban area, and instead of open space or wild spaces. And does that change the results in any way? Like, does it impact it at all?
Yeah, I mean, because the data collection is up to the volunteer scientists, they're just going to collect where it's easiest, and that means it is their backyards. That ends up meaning that it is a biased data collection. And so if you are interested in sort of the local bees, the suburban bees, that's fine. But if you wanted to know more about bees across Colorado, you would have to gather data from other locations. And so that's what we're kind of looking at now, is if we wanted to revive this project and start collecting more data, where would we do it? Would we repeat here in the suburban area, or would we put new nesting blocks in like forested areas, maybe up in the mountains, or would we go out to the Eastern Plains and gather data there? So yeah, it is definitely a biased data collection.
Bees are so interesting. Bees are so interesting. Like, you know, just how they work. And I remember looking at like the populations and the demographics, and I was just seeing that it's mostly female bees from what I was reading, and in terms of like making their nest and production, like mostly it's females and the minority is males.
Yeah, so that also depends on the species. So the deal is, and what I'm guessing you're thinking of is like honeybees that live in a hive.
Yeah.
In that case, yes, if you're looking at a hive of honeybees, the most, if not all, of the bees in that moment are going to be female. So the queen, which is making all the eggs, you know, she's female. All the worker bees, they're female. It's all female bees. So it's only on a seasonal basis where drones, the male bees, are produced, and they have a role in sort of like mating with the queen and forming new hives and stuff like that. So for the most part, all female, at least for honeybees. And that's mostly true also for bumblebees. They also kind of live in these hives, and same thing. It's all female. All the workers are female. The queen's female, all that. And it's just once in a while that they have male bumblebees to create new hives. But most species of bees actually live alone. So most species of bees don't live in hives. They just live on their own, like a normal insect might, just, you know, out alone. And so those species of bees, it'll tend to be closer to 1-to-1 male to female. But even so, like, obviously if we're having a project based on gathering data about nests that are made by bees, it's still going to be, you know, all those nests were created by female bees. So even when we talk about solitary bees, like, yeah, the females are kind of the most important of the two. How
big of a role do bees have in like pollination?
Huge. Yeah. I mean, insect pollinators in general have a huge role in the pollination of plants. I mean, paleontologists pretty much think that when flowering plants first appeared in the time of the dinosaurs, that it was because those plants were able to sort of co-evolve with insects that were able to pollinate those plants. So insect pollinators are integral to plant life cycles, into pollination, into like human food sources, because a lot of our food comes from pollinated plants, from you know, fruits and vegetables and stuff. And so insects in general are very important. Bees, of the pollinators, bees are some of the most important. So for example, bumblebees are some of the best pollinators for solanaceous plants. So that's like stuff in the tomato family. And that's because those kinds of flowers will only release their pollen if they're like vibrated at a certain frequency. And it just so happens that bumblebees they know how to do that. They'll land on a flower and buzz their wings at that frequency, and they can make the pollen come out of the flower. And so those particular plants have specialized in bee pollination. Like only the bumblebees can pollinate those plants.
Just because I'm not out there every day, I'm like, do they play a big role? Like,
yes.
Are there other insects that do it as well? Because, you know, there's a lot of stats out there, but I'm not sure, like when they say, you know, for example, bees are responsible for like 75% of pollination or something, like, and other insects, like how much of it is actually spread across bees or just other insects?
And the other insects.
Yeah.
And part of it is that bees are so charismatic. Like, we love bees as people. We love bees because they're fuzzy and cute and stuff like that. And so I think they get a lot of focus because of that. But there are tons of other insects that do pollinate. So there's butterflies and moths that pollinate. There's beetles that pollinate. And there's flies that pollinate. But of course, flies aren't nearly as cute as bees, and so I don't think those flies get studied as much, which is a shame because the flies are really cool too. One of the other interesting pollinators is actually wasps, including the ones that we hate, like yellow jackets and paper wasps and stuff. They are not a huge percentage of the pollination activity that's out there, but they do pollinate. They're sort of incidental pollinators. They'll go from flower to flower as they're maybe hunting for other things, but they do end up pollinating flowers in the process. So a lot of people will ask me like, oh, you know about insects. Well, then what's the point of yellow jackets? Because people just hate yellow jackets. And it's hard to answer that sort of question. Like, well, what is the purpose of any insect? I don't know. But yellow jackets at the very least do have some helpful qualities. Like they actually are pollinators as well.
Yeah, the only thing I remember from wasps is just getting stung like crazy when I was a kid. And for wasps too, they can keep stinging. They don't stop. They're ruthless. Yeah. Whereas with the bumblebees or the queen bee, like they can sting a couple times, but the worker bees can only sting once and then they're done. Yeah,
I'm not as confident about the queen bees and how many times they can sting, but I do know the worker bees, especially worker honey bees. Yeah, they sting once and then that's it.
Yeah. Why do you think that is? Like, what is the point of that?
Oh, right? The point of it is to protect the hive, and that's why basically any bee or wasp will sting. So if it's able to sting, it's because it's trying to protect something. And usually that's going to be the hive.
But why do they only get one?
They only get one. Well, it's because when a honeybee stings you and as it flies away, if I remember, like some of its internal organs get left behind. So the stinger gets left behind. The venom glands get left behind. But I think some other organs get left behind as well. And so when it flies away, that's it. It needs those organs and it no longer has them. And so that particular worker bee is done for.
That's so interesting. It's like the physiology of the bee that, after it stings something, that the stinger rips out some of its organ as well.
Yes. Huh. Yeah. So in that case, yeah. Whereas like yellow jackets, I don't know, they hold on to their stinger so they can sting multiple times. But yeah, honeybees, it's gnarly.
Yeah. I think yellow jackets have it better.
Yes. Yeah. From an individual insect point of view, yeah, the yellow jackets can live to sting another day.
And then for their production in honey, is that their food source, like primary food source, or is that sort of just like a byproduct or something that they make?
It is a food source, especially for overwintering. So in the spring and summer, like it's fine, you get to go out and visit a flower and there's going to be nectar there. But of course that's just for a short window during the year. And so when the flowers are out, they will gather pollen and also nectar, go back to their hive and then make honey out of that nectar that they've gathered. And that is a food source for the rest of the year and for their offspring, so the larvae that are in the hive.
Yeah, I never know which honey to buy, like at the grocery store. Like I'm never sure, like, is this one organic? Is this one like certified?
Oh boy, yeah, that's a whole conversation. And don't look at me again. I study solitary bees, so I'm not as confident about honeybees. But yeah, the conversation around honey can get complicated because like you mentioned, like organic honey, like that's great, but sometimes there's not even a real guarantee that it's 100% organic because they're honeybees. They're going to fly everywhere, and sometimes they have quite a wide range. And so they might, hopefully just visit your organic flowers, because that's what it usually means, is like you haven't sprayed the hives, but then you also haven't sprayed like the flowers around there. But there's no guarantee that the bees will stay in that non-sprayed area. They might go far and wide and visit a flower that's been sprayed for some other reason, and then suddenly it's not organic because that bee visited that one flower. So I think it's a worthwhile thing. It's it's good to get organic honey, but it is kind of complicated. Sorry to break the boat there. Yeah.
Yeah, I was watching this video too, where like when they visit, you can have this experience where you can just have all these bees on you, like fully engulf your body.
I've seen pictures. Yes,
you get the beards, like the bee beards.
Yes.
And they're not even they don't even have equipment on or like the proper protection there. And so maybe they're really well behaved, and maybe there's somebody there to like facilitate that.
So in that case, where you see pictures of people with bee beards, or they just have bees on them in those big aggregations, it's usually because they have, if I remember, sprayed something on themselves that smells like the queen bee. And so in that case, those worker bees are going to smell you and think that you're the queen bee, and their first instinct is to like protect the queen bee, to protect you. And so that's why they swarm then. They swarm on you. But there's no real incentive for them to sting because they don't sense that there's a threat. All they smell is that, oh, the queen bee is here. So then why would I need to sting anything? And so that's why you can have those giant swarms on people and they don't get stung.
Okay. So only when they feel threatened, or, maybe they're young, that they feel like they need to protect, then will they...
If there is a threat to the hive, then yes, they will sting.
Then they'll get aggressive and they'll sting you.
Yeah.
Have you been stung? Do you like bee stings?
No, I don't particularly enjoy it, though. It's been a long time since I've been stung. Again, if you're just out and about and you see a bee on a flower, they're not, and as long as you're not pestering them, they're not going to bother you. Okay. Though I do remember, again, comes back to yellow jackets. I did get stung by a yellow jacket when I was a kid, and that left a distinct memory. But yeah, I haven't been stung all that much.
Cool. Yeah. So going back to your project, with the collections there and the public data, what was the research question that you were trying to solve?
So what we were interested in is the nesting biology, or the nesting characteristics of these different species of bees. So solitary bees and wasps will lay their eggs in a pre-existing cavity, like in a tree or in a nesting block, or what have you, and then there'll be a couple different nest cells. So it'll be like a provision, which is just like food for the egg once it hatches. And then you have an egg. It'll be sealed off with different materials, to separate the different nest cells. And then that whole nest will get sealed into that cavity by a nest plug at the end. And what that nest plug is made out of really varies. It can be whole leaf chunks that are pushed in there. It can be chewed leaf bits. It can be mud. It can be pebbles. It can be resin. And so depending on the species of bee or wasp, it'll be different materials in the nest plug. And so what we were interested in is to know which species, first of all, which species were showing up in the Boulder, Colorado area. And then also, if those species are showing up, what are they making their nests out of? We know the nest characteristics for a lot of species of solitary bees and wasps, but not all of them. And so if we were able to collect any more information on these different species and what they make their nests out of, that's primarily what we were interested in.
So just more understanding of different types of species and how they make their nests, essentially.
Exactly.
Were there a lot of species that showed?
We ended up seeing, let me think here, at least 37 species of bees and at least 10 species of wasps.
And they're all native to Colorado?
Almost all of them. So we did catch a few species of bees that were introduced.
Okay.
So I think it was like 3 species out of the 37 we saw. So not that many, but there were a few that were introduced.
In the end, looking at their nests and how they create their homes there, what were you trying to figure out there? Like just what species correlated to what types of nests were being created?
Yeah. Which species correlated to which nests, so that in the future we could maybe go out in the field and take a look at a nesting block that has these nests and figure out, just based on the nests, which species are there. So if you have good enough data, you should be able to look at a nest and its different characteristics, what it's made of, nest diameter, all that sort of thing. And just based on those pieces of information, draw a conclusion about which species made that nest.
Okay.
So this could also be a good way to identify bees and wasps in the wild without having to catch and kill them. You just put out a nesting block, wait for them to make a nest, and then based on that nest, you can figure out who made that nest, which species made that nest.
Are these nests like pretty typical, or are some of them more funky than others?
Oh man, they get kind of strange. Usually they're like a lot of them are chewed vegetation, so it looks like someone has put like mashed up spinach in the hole.
Okay.
But my favorites were made by the grass wasps. So there's this genus of grass wasp called Isodontia, and they don't really make a plug in the typical sense where, it would seal up the cavity. Once they're done making their nest, they'll just put dried blades of grass in the hole. And so it just looks like this nesting block hole with this big wad of grass sticking out of it. And it's just kind of ridiculous. And so those wasps were my favorite in this project because of that. Like, they don't make the pretty nests. They just make a nest and then shove it full of dried grass.
Yeah, and then most of these were done in that apparatus there that you guys made with the block and all the drilled holes in. Do you see that like they would do like very similar nests if you didn't put that block there? Like would they make their own nests in a similar way in their own where in their own hive, I guess?
Yes, I mean we're hoping so. So if they weren't nesting in a nesting block, most likely they would find a hole in a dead tree or a fence post or some other cavity that's above ground. So if there wasn't a nesting block, they certainly would have found a nest somewhere else. And we're just hoping that the nest characteristics and the materials that they're using, they're going to be similar in the nesting block as they would be in the tree. Just because the species, the bees and wasps themselves that are making these nests, they're very picky about the materials they use. So if a bee is using mud in its nests, usually it's only going to use mud. It's not going to switch halfway through its lifetime and say, I want to make it out of chewed vegetation. Usually one species will stick with one or two nesting materials.
It's interesting that they make it out of mud.
Yeah, some of them do. Yeah.
And that it's not only like chewed vegetation. Like how do they, acquire a mass amount of mud?
Usually it's, after it rains, kind of like it is right now, there's a lot of puddles, and at the margins of those puddles will be a stretch of mud. So there's some kinds of bees that'll gather mud for their nests, and then a lot of different kinds of wasps will gather mud. So if you've ever heard of like a mud dauber wasp, a mud dauber wasp, they will gather mud from puddles and carry it to their nest. So it's just a little bit of mud at a time, and I'm sure they've got their favorite puddles or whatever where they know that there's going to be mud, but they'll just gather it in their legs and then fly off and add it to the nest and then make a couple more trips and just like that. Now
going forward, are you going to continue with bees, like studying more in the field of bees and how they work, or?
So my hope from here is to go into the museum world, to find a job in a museum somewhere. And that'll most likely mean that my research project here with bees and wasps will probably come to an end. I did, however, recently have the thought that it would be cool if I were to go on and do a PhD, it probably would be to study these solitary bees and wasps, because I think there is a lot more to learn. And I do think that these bees and wasps are really interesting. So it would be fun, but I don't know if that's for me at this point in my life. So
yeah. It's a big world, big insect and bug world, and so much more to study there. When you, perhaps when you're thinking about like more graduate studies or a PhD, do you think you'll still stay in Boulder, or would you want to do it somewhere else?
So if I were to continue on and get my PhD in cavity nesting bees, it probably wouldn't be here. There are a couple different researchers at Colorado State in Fort Collins who are doing research currently on cavity nesting bees. So as much as it pains me to like go to the dark side, I would probably go up to CSU, because that's where a lot of current cavity nesting bee research is happening.
So you wouldn't look at another state. You would still stay in Colorado.
I mean, I guess there are a couple other states where this research is happening. So the Minnesota Bee Atlas is actually doing work on cavity nesting bees as well. So they have same thing. It's like a citizen science project, participatory science project, where they're giving nesting blocks to people, and then they can gather the data on these bees and wasps. And so I take it that if there's someone there researching cavity nesting bees and wasps, feasibly I could go to Minnesota to do that as well. But yeah, if it came down to it, I've already got connections at CSU, and I know that research is happening here in Colorado.
Montana is a huge state and has a lot of outdoors, as you know. The reason for coming to Boulder was very specific to your project there, or the professor, not necessarily like the availability of like open spaces, right?
Oh, I see. Yeah, it very much was like focused on my advisors, focused on the museum studies program here.
Okay.
Yeah, if my focus was on the places with the most open space, or like places where bees haven't been studied as much, yeah, maybe I would have gone somewhere else. But because of the program, I came here to Colorado.
Would you ever go back to Montana?
I would certainly like to. One of my job prospects that I've been kind of keeping an eye on is the Missoula Butterfly House and Insectarium. So this butterfly house has been in Missoula for years, but they're now building themselves a brand new facility. And so it's going to be huge. They're going to have all the exhibits and butterfly house stuff that they want to have. But then that means that they're going to need to hire a few more people as well. So that would be my ideal place to go, because it means I'd get to go back to Missoula, which is where I did my undergrad, and I'd be closer to my family. And I like Montana. I may be biased having grown up there, but I just particularly love Montana. But the thing about Montana is it's kind of a small place. Yeah. So there's, especially when it comes to museums, there's not very many opportunities. So still keeping my options open.
Montana's beautiful.
It is.
Montana's beautiful. Obviously all the open space and all the wildlife out there, and being close to a whole other country, being close to Canada there. It's just so wild how such a big state doesn't have as much population.
Nope.
As I would think it would have in proportion to the state. Is it because it's just harsh, like a harsh climate to live in?
Oh, why does Montana have so few people? Probably a lot of those northerly states in the interior Mountain West have fairly low population densities. So Montana, Wyoming, both of the Dakotas tend to be pretty sparse. I think probably part of it is that it is like harsh climate. Yeah, it pretty regularly gets down to like -30 or -40 Fahrenheit in January in Montana. And there's probably some historical reasons it's not very dense either. Like the farming isn't as great as maybe some places further east, like in the Midwest. But yeah, Montanans are particularly proud of their state, and I think we're fine with it being sparse. Yeah.
It gives you more of an opportunity to, have space to move around and kind of enjoy more nature to yourself.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, that's fair. Maybe we should stop talking about Montana. So
I know that's always the thing.
Nobody else is gonna come.
Yeah, Montanans love to talk about it, but then it's like, okay, but that's it. No, don't come here. Yeah, Montana's full.
Yeah, just like keep it quiet. No more migrations out here. We'll keep it to ourselves. Yeah. But it said that your undergrad was in Montana. There was that. Was there a big study or emphasis on entomology?
Oh, so I went and got my undergrad at the University of Montana, which does not have a very big entomological focus. There is some work done in entomology where insects are just like a study system for some other question, either in genetics or development or something, or where insects are the pests for forests and stuff like that. So not a huge entomological focus, but I ended up doing some undergrad research on stick insects just because the professor I was working under was a physiologist, a thermal physiologist. And so he had some insect study systems, and I he was interested in the insects more for the questions he was wanting to ask, and I was more interested in the insects just because they were insects. So it ended up working out. But at U of M, yeah, not a big entomological focus.
Okay.
But MSU is kind of the more entomologically focused one. They are the ones to have the state insect collection.
Because I was just imagining that, maybe there's like the Department of Natural Resources out there, and maybe they're plugged into the universities more, so maybe they can recruit future students to join their team and whatnot.
Yeah. So where there is an entomological focus, that's usually how it goes, is like insects are to be studied so that we can figure out how to get rid of them. Like they're just pests for agriculture or pests for our forests. So
okay. So now you said you want to more focus on like museums, but have you ever considered just like being like working out in the field as like a ranger or like part of the DNR at all?
So yeah, so after undergrad, I was a field technician for the U.S. Department of Agriculture. So that it was so much fun. I basically just got to drive around Montana and survey for grasshoppers, which means like every once in a while I hop out of my truck and go and count some grasshoppers. But I was out in the field, Monday through Thursday for most of the summer, which I really enjoyed. My wife, however, did not. She did not enjoy just like being alone at home for most of the week. And so if, in another universe, I would love to be a field technician for the USDA or for the Department of Natural Resources or whatever else, to be a ranger out in the field, because it was a lot of fun. But as it is, like, yeah, I'm getting my interaction with insects in another way in the museum context.
Okay. And like, would you want to be like a presenter at a museum, or do you want to work sort of behind the scenes?
Oh, either way, honestly, because to be like an educator at a museum, I think would be a lot of fun. I think museums are some of the spaces where a lot of science communication is happening these days. That's where a lot of the public can go just on their own accord, learning, of their own volition to go and learn more. So museums are valuable for that reason. And we do need educators then to do that work. I particularly enjoy talking about science to whoever wants to listen. And so if I were to be sort of the front end presenter or educator in a museum, I think I'd enjoy it. But that's the other thing, is a big natural history museum will have a lot of people working behind the scenes that you as a visitor will never know. And so that's what a collections manager does. They just kind of live in the collections and make sure that they're safe and sound and well researched. And so that's probably my ideal position. But it doesn't mean, I'd be like squirreled away in some back room and I wouldn't run into visitors all that often.
Yeah, but you get to, do something you like and spend a lot of time with that. So, it's a trade-off, but, I think it would be worth it. Yeah.
And that's not to say that, if I was a collections manager or someone working in the back, that I would never run into visitors. That I'm sure there's always going to be tours going through, or student groups or interns, or whatever else. So there would still be some interaction with visitors and with the public, but it just wouldn't be nearly as much as like if you were an educator and that's what you're doing all day, every day.
Yeah. Wow, that's cool. Yeah. And, next time I need to go to a museum and, really like dig into like how everything is preserved and kind of look how things are like just held away, like it would give me a completely different lens. I would be like, wow, it takes so much to actually preserve this. And like it's not just so easy where it's like, I don't know, some taxidermy or something, not to say taxidermy is
I was gonna say, that's not easy either, but I think a lot of people don't realize that it's only something like 1 or 2% of a museum's holdings are on exhibit at any one time. It's the vast majority of their specimens that are in collections at any one time. And so, people just don't realize they just see what they see, which is the the point of going to a museum. everything that's behind glass, but they don't realize that those specimens had to come from somewhere, and it's usually from the museum's own collections. Yeah, and if you're like blown away by how much work is involved, and you're like, oh, I never thought about that much work is involved. That's kind of the point. Like, I think a lot of museum exhibit creators, that's what they're going for. They want it to feel just sort of like seamless and just, oh wow, it's almost like they plucked this butterfly from the field and just put it in the exhibit. Like that sense of sort of magic and realism, and you don't even have to think about like, well, why is there a taxidermied turtle in there and what does it take to care for it? Like most visitors aren't going to think about that, and that's fine. That's good. The exhibit creators are wanting visitors to maybe not think about how the taxidermy turtle is cared for, but what is that taxidermy turtle trying to teach you? Like what lesson is involved there? Like what does the text say about where this particular species of turtle lived or whatever else? So if it feels like there's a surprising amount of work to specimen conservation, there is. And yeah, it's not like we are kind of trying to pull a fast one on you. Right? We want the exhibits to be cool and magical and not have any, what we want you to learn is what we want you to learn. So,
yeah. Preservation is difficult. And now in field work, like for the collection part, that takes a long time too. Right. Yeah.
Depending on how you're going about your field work. So organizing an expedition to go out and collect specimens, like that's what the expedition is for, sort of thing. That does take a lot of work. And especially more these days because it takes a lot of permitting. So, right, you can't just go out and grab an animal and bring it home with you. You have to apply for a permit with however many different layers of government that you're underneath. So if, you collect here in Boulder, there's probably a permit you have to apply for the city and a permit for the state, and there might be some federal permits and all the rest. So it does take a lot of work, not even to mention the logistics of having the actual people, the actual collectors going out and collecting, and okay, they're going to need food and shelter and all that sort of stuff. So organizing an expedition can be a lot of work. Thankfully, a lot of museums can get specimens in other ways. So let's see. I know that museums will often get bird specimens from cities when the birds hit windows. So a lot of bird like window strike kills end up going to museums.
Are the birds are running into the windows? You're saying?
Yep. So in big cities, the birds will run into windows, into skyscraper windows, and die. And so you end up having, dozens of birds just littered on the streets because they flew into the city and ran into a window. But ideally, a museum would be able to pick up at least some of those birds and bring them into the collection.
Are you into bird watching at all?
No, I not particularly, but as time goes forward and as I start thinking about, okay, one day I might have a backyard and it'd be great to have a bird feeder in there, I can see how I probably could get really into bird watching. And I think it's just a personality thing, right? The kinds of people who are really interested in one topic, like insects or bugs or whatever, you just kind of switch it a little bit and then you could be really interested in birds. So I'm not at the moment, but I could see how I could be a birder.
These folks are out there, they have their full binoculars and they've got their extended lenses. They're crouched in, very difficult positions, but they're willing to do it because they love the bird so much. So I don't know if you ever kind of cross fields and get into bigger animals instead of just small insects, bug animals. Maybe that could be something that you're into. I don't know.
I could see it.
Cool. Well, now I know you're busy. I know you've been doing a lot of travel and conferences.
Oh, well, actually, so this week is interesting for me because really I'm not that busy. I graduated just last weekend, and so I'm taking this week off for the most part. But then I do have a conference this coming weekend. Actually, the American Alliance of Museums is coming to Denver for their annual conference. And so this coming weekend, I'll be driving to the Denver Convention Center and going and listening to talks and looking at posters and exhibits and all the rest. So, I've been to a couple other conferences as a part of my time here as a master's student. I've been to the Entomological Society of America meeting.
Mm-hmm. Where was that one at?
Here in Denver as well.
Here's Denver.
It was fall of 2021.
Okay.
So that's another, same with AAM. The ESA meetings will move around from city to city every year. And it just so happened that the year I started here, the meetings were going to be in Denver. And so it was a no-brainer, like, I have to go. So went to those meetings. And then this last fall of 2022, there was Mountain Plains Museum Association conference, and that was in Oklahoma. So close enough that I said, thought it would be good to go. So I went to that one as well. But yeah, this is probably going to be my last conference for my graduate studies career.
Last one. No. How many have you been to overall?
I think it is just those three then.
Just those three?
Yeah. So entomology meetings and then a couple of museum conferences.
And they're all in Denver, right?
The entomology one was in Denver, and this upcoming American Alliance of Museums one is in Denver. But yeah, just the one, like Mountain Plains Museum one, that was in Tulsa, Oklahoma.
Okay.
So all of them have been relatively close. Yeah.
Yeah, it seems like Denver's a big hub for...
Yeah, that's the nice thing about going to school really close to a large city, is that conferences will occasionally be located in that big city, and then it's really easy to go to a conference that would otherwise be difficult to go to. The entomology meetings this past fall were in Vancouver, British Columbia. Okay. So much more difficult to try and figure out how to get to Vancouver than, just hop in your car and go down to Denver for the weekend and you're right there. Yeah.
And then so postgraduate here, do you have any travel plans or any fun things that you want to do? Finally, just to de-stress a little bit, right? Because I would imagine past couple of weeks are chaotic, just trying to order up all these logistics and give all these talks and presentations. And so just the time to de-stress, do you have any upcoming plans?
Yeah. Past couple of weeks, we're very busy. I defended my thesis and graduated and all the rest. So this coming weekend is another conference, and then immediately after that, so 1 week from today, Maggie and I are going to fly to Scotland, and we'll be there for a little under 2 weeks. So that's kind of our congratulatory graduation trip. We're going to go to Scotland, and we have a friend over there in Edinburgh, so we'll kind of tour the town and go see things. But then a large chunk of that trip will just be, honestly, probably a lot of hiking, just in the Scottish Highlands. Yeah.
Very cool. Yeah, I remember going to Scotland, and I remember there was a lot of nature, and there's a lot of unique architecture. So in the town, there's a royal castle. So it's like the Royal Mile, I think they call it.
Oh, yes, in Edinburgh.
In Edinburgh, yeah. So that was really cool to see, and sort of we took a ghost tour.
I've heard. Yeah, I think my friend in Edinburgh talked about that too.
Yeah, so I think they're into that. They're really into their horrors and their ghosts and their spiritual beliefs there. But yeah, we took it at night, and they showed us into these caverns and they were telling us about stories and how they had their disease that was flowing around back then. It was the plague that they had, and so that impacted a lot of folks, and they had passed away from there, and so they're just trying to obviously they're trying to scare everybody, but really cool place overall, and I'm happy that you guys get the chance to travel to Scotland. Is there anywhere else that you're going?
Not just Scotland. Scotland. So we'll go to Edinburgh, we'll go to Aberdeen, we'll go to Cairngorms National Park. That's kind of in the middle of Scotland, but that's kind of all we have on the docket so far. Yeah, this week again that I have off, I'll probably do more planning, but I think we're intending to keep it pretty low key. It'll probably just be a lot of hiking. But it is funny that you mentioned birds, because a lot of the recommendations I got for where to go in Scotland I got from our vertebrate zoology collections manager, who had been to Scotland like a year ago for a conference. And so I knew that she had been, and so I asked her, hey, where did you go and what did you see? And so she sent her whole long list of recommendations, and most of her recommendations for where to go to hike and where to go to walk also came with little additions about like, oh, and this is a good place to see puffins, or like, oh, and here's these certain birds that you can see over here. And so she's very much a birder. And so, yeah, if I wanted to get into birding, I guess this trip could be a great way to do it. I've already got lots of recommendations from her.
Hey, there you go. Now, was there anything that you wanted to see particularly in Scotland?
I don't know. I'm down to see all of it.
Yeah.
There is, some museums in Edinburgh. That's probably not surprising, but there's some museums I'd like to see.
Are they related to insects and bugs?
One of them is a natural history museum. Yeah.
All
So I'm
right.
guessing there'll be some critters there, some bugs. Otherwise, I don't know if there's anything I particularly want to see. I did want to try. This is like the one bucket list item that I have. I do want to try this drink called Iron Brew.
Iron Brew.
Have you heard of Iron Brew?
Is that like a beer?
No, so it's like a soda. It's pop.
Soda.
Yeah.
Huh.
It's just like bright orange. And it's called Iron Brew because I think back in the day I think it had more, but I think it still has some ferrous oxide. So it has some iron in the soda. And so it's been called like the national drink of Scotland, like just behind Scotch. And it's like the most popular soda in the country. So it's like that's the one thing I feel like I need to try is this drink called Iron Brew. But otherwise, I don't know, nothing too big on the docket.
Yeah, maybe we can get you like a kilt, like a Scottish kilt or something.
I did actually ask my grandpa, like, where should I go in Scotland, because his side of the family is Scottish. So his last name is McRae, which is very Scottish. And so I just asked him, like, hey, is there McRae heritage in any certain part of the country, any certain part of Scotland? And he said probably not, but maybe I'll turn up something if I do some more Googling. But it's interesting because each of the clans of Scotland, each of the family clans, have their own pattern of tartan, of plaid. And so if you really wanted to get into it, like I probably could find a place that sells like plaid fabric or tartan fabric and find like the McRae clan, fabric. Yeah.
Huh. That could be fun.
I don't know if I'd put it into a kilt, but yeah, it'd be good. It'd be good.
Yeah. Wow. That sounds like fun. Hopefully you get some time to de-stress a little bit and come back and refreshed and move on to the next part of your journey there.
Yeah. Should be good. I'm looking forward to it because, to be a graduate student is to always be thinking about what you're studying and to always have it in the back of your mind that, I should be working. So to just go on a proper vacation, I think it'll be a really necessary thing, but also I'm very excited about it.
Yeah. For the culture of grad school, like, do you think there's a healthy culture here in Boulder?
Oh boy. I think,
like, just in terms of like stress.
In terms of graduate student culture, I think CU Boulder is okay. I think the eBio. So for context, I was in the Museum and Field Studies program. Yeah. But that program is very interdisciplinary, so that includes natural history, so that it's biology, that includes cultural studies, that includes anthropology, that includes art history. And so because I was into the entomology collection, that also meant that I was technically a part of the eBio program, the evolutionary and ecological biology program, something like that. Anyway, the graduate student culture in eBio, I enjoyed being around those graduate students, and they were always very encouraging. But I've also heard that departmentally that eBio is struggling a little bit in terms of how to arbitrate between mentor-mentee relationships and so on. So even though my experience for these past 2 years was good, I can imagine that any graduate student that's in a program for more than a few years is going to find that program's flaws. Graduate student culture, it's complicated.
Yeah, and there's other departments and in graduate programs specifically, maybe there's is just under a lot more stress because they're trying to find funding, or making sure that they can stay here themselves and they can take care of their own expenses, on top of the already stressful subject matter that they're studying, just these outside factors. Hopefully that doesn't cause like too much distress or anxiety towards like these graduate students.
Yeah, I think I was particularly lucky because the Museum and Field Studies program here is very good about paying its students. So while I was here, I worked in the entomology collection, and that was actually considered like a part-time job. Okay. So I got a stipend from doing that work. So that meant I didn't have to think about funding. The tuition, my tuition was waived, and I was getting a stipend. Whereas I know some of my graduate student friends who are in engineering are applying for fellowships and trying to find funding so that they can continue to be, a PhD student. Yeah. And so I can't imagine like that. Yeah, that would be stressful. Yeah. Not only to try and adjust to a new town and adjust to a new school, but then trying to find funding for yourself so that you can keep pursuing the research that you want to pursue. So I was particularly lucky that I was a funded student.
So it was more like a plug and play, essentially, like from where you came from previous, you can just come in here and not really have to worry about like the outside pressures of, rent.
Right? Well, so that's the thing is, it was nice in terms of like, yes, all of our students are funded. You don't have to worry about that part. But the stipend that I got is still like not great. It was for a full year. And again, this is like August 15th to May 15th. So it's just one academic year. They don't support you in the summer, which is a bummer. But just for, while I was working there, a year's worth of stipend is about $22,000, which is not enough to live in Boulder. So that's the thing is like, CU Boulder, fantastic campus, fantastic program, all the rest, fantastic research that's happening here. But it's an incredibly expensive town. Yeah. And so that stipend of $22,000 a year is not enough to support yourself unless you're living with roommates, or maybe you're lucky and you get into graduate student housing or so on. So my wife and I ended up just like living in the next town over. And then I, during my time here as a graduate student, I would just ride the bus into town. So I was basically a commuter student for these past 2 years.
Yeah, that's smart. It's a way to curb your costs for sure.
Yeah.
As well as being able to enjoy the environment.
Yeah. Yeah. So, and I don't know how I could have done it if I didn't have, Maggie doesn't appreciate that I call her this, but she's my permanent roommate. Like we're married. Yeah. That's one of the benefits of marriage, is that you're economically more stable. And you know that as well. Yeah. Cause otherwise if we were just alone as students, like it's so much harder to find housing and to hold on to it. So, sure. Yeah, Boulder's expensive.
Yeah. And so it's just it's a big topic across a lot of colleges. It's just like not even like beyond money, right? It's just like mental health is a big problem, yes. Right? Yeah. Just not feeling stable, whether it's outside factors like economy or personal factors. Going through your program there, do you think that like mental health was anything to think about, or was
I think mental health is always something to think about, especially in graduate school. Again, I consider myself lucky because the Museum and Field Studies program is integrated into a working natural history museum on campus, and so it's not only that I'm in a research lab with my advisor, but I'm also enmeshed in this community where it's the other collections managers that are running the other collections, and the other labs that come with them, and the public section of the museum that is in charge of educating, that is in charge of running educational programs, and so on. And so to have that sense of community on the whole, I think was very helpful. Whereas I can imagine if I was in a more sort of hard STEM, like maybe engineering or physics or whatever, and it's just you and your advisor in their lab and it's a little more insular, I can imagine that would be a lot tougher of an experience to go through. So I think I was lucky for that reason. But I do know that, other folks in my cohort had to deal with mental health issues just because of the stresses of graduate school.
Yeah.
Even if things in graduate school are going well, you're still going through graduate school, and that's a stressful experience. And so, even though we were lucky to be in that community, I think it's mental health is always a consideration.
Yeah, because you're always struggling. It's like, this is something I really want to do, right? This is a subject that I want to investigate more in and invest in more and study more. But at the same time, you're like, man, like, there's so much pressure. Like, if I don't get a position, if I don't make it, if I have to make a lot of sacrifices and changes, it impacts the way that you think about how you complete your degree or if you get to complete your degree. So
absolutely,
it's a very privileged thing to have, to have funding and mental health being like not a huge factor.
Yeah. Again, I'll say it a million times. I consider myself like very, very lucky.
Yeah.
That I had a funded position, so I didn't have to think about that. Came in, found a project fairly quickly, so I didn't have to worry about that too much.
Mm-hmm. Support system.
Yeah, a support system, not only through my wife and friends and so on, but through other organizations on campus. So that's what I would always encourage a graduate student to do is like, you're doing your research, and I know you love your research, but always think about the community that you can make outside of your immediate program, so that you're not just surrounded by the same people every single day. So that's what I did. I was the co-president of the CU Museum Club, so we had people from outside the museum and field studies program who would come and attend that, and then I was a part of Graduate Christian Fellowship, and so that provided some much needed community that was outside of the museum.
Like, do you think undergraduate students get enough support? Like, do you think they have enough of a support system in place?
I think, well, maybe I'll just speak to this particular campus. I think CU Boulder is very focused on its undergraduates, which is to their benefit, right? They have so many more undergraduate students, and so to have those support systems in place for the undergraduates, I think, is a good thing. Mm-hmm. And I hope that they're well used and helpful. I do think, though, graduate students, just the type of work they're doing is more inherently stressful, because, like, okay, classes are one thing, but if you're a graduate student, you're doing classes and you're teaching, or you're doing the research, or in my case, I was working in the collection in the museum. And so it's, plus your thesis research or whatever else, your actual writing and your actual dissertation. Yeah. So I think graduate students have some unique needs and some unique support requirements that I think every institution would be wise to think about. Mm-hmm. CU Boulder is good about supporting undergraduates. I think they're pretty good about supporting graduate students, but it can always be better.
Is it weird, like, coming back into a college scene and like sort of being, more senior in terms of being like a graduate? Like, is it strange that, like, oh, okay, now we're back and game day still happens, and everybody's out partying and tailgating? It
was weird. Oh man, I do remember when I first got here, getting back into the college setting. Actually, it wasn't that weird, because I enjoyed undergrad, I enjoyed school, I enjoyed college, all the rest. So to be back here and it's like, oh, I'm taking classes again. Like, I know how this works. This is great. But yeah, I think graduate students especially, you're so focused on your research and you're so focused on what you're learning about that, attending football games or whatever is not nearly as much as a consideration. So it's weird when it's just like on a Friday and you're walking from one research building to the other and you're like, why is it so busy? And then it's like, oh, it's a football game. And that's what college campuses do. But then it's weird because it's not, I feel like I'm not the intended audience anymore or something. I don't know. Mm-hmm. It was also weird because I still feel like I'm always learning. Yeah. And so maybe that's imposter syndrome. Maybe it's just my personality. I don't know. But I'm always thinking like, okay, I'm still learning. So then when I get here and I see like the undergraduates, especially like the incoming freshmen who this is their first time living alone or their first time away from their hometown or whatever else. And they're just like, you could tell some of them are just kind of floundering and lost and like, okay, what do I do? Then it was different, because then I felt like this is very weird that I'm on a college campus and I enjoy the setting and I enjoy taking classes, but now I feel like a little more of an adult just surrounded by teenagers.
Yeah.
And that vibe was a little weird to get past. And even still, it's just like, here I am thinking about my thesis, and then there'll be just undergraduates like partying on a random Friday or whatever.
So your mindset's like completely different. It's sort of more like a work mindset, right? Like you want to produce something, you want to output something like IP or something, right? Whereas, maybe the undergrads are here and they're just like more experiential. It's like, oh, what is this first time like out of the house?
Yeah. That's not to say that that's a bad thing, because I remember when I was an undergraduate and that's what I was going for, right? It's the first time away from home. You're just trying to figure out how to live on your own, how to be an adult for the first time.
Yeah.
So that's not a bad thing. That's good. It's just funny then that process of them learning what it's like to live on their own is happening in the same place as, maybe this research is happening where I'm trying to do my work. So just, the college campus is a complex place and all of these things are happening at the same time. So it was kind of strange to run into that as I'm thinking more about it in terms of work, and then they're just here to have a good time at college, which again, good, but it's just weird that it's happening at the same place.
Yeah. Because I know, like, just it's such a different perspective. Like when I was going undergrad, I was like, oh, okay, this is going to be an experience, right? Like I'm here to learn and maybe I'll get a job, but mostly it was experiential. The environment where I was, it's not like, okay, I need to make something. Like I need to output.
Yeah.
Right. And you have professors that are with you that are guiding you when you're an undergrad and they're teaching you, but as more of a graduate student, those professors are more, they're still guiding you, but maybe they're more on a peer level in a way, where they're just like, well, I don't know this answer either. Like that's why you're here doing the research, right?
Yeah, exactly.
But I can give you some input, and at the end they still expect a result. So it's sort of like work. Right. But work in like a more, I don't know, progressive, young, like where everybody is still sort of similar age cohort. Was that something you thought was like difficult to have sort of like a mixing in work with education?
Oh, I don't know if in terms of my own personal work and my own personal education, I don't think I found it all that strange, especially because, the program I was a part of, the Museum Studies program, was very hands-on in both work and education. So what would happen is that in my collections management class, we would learn about data management or databases or something. And then I would go upstairs, for the afternoon to do my work and run into that exact problem. It's like, okay, we have to database these, 100 grasshoppers. And so it was very easy to sort of understand how work issues can be addressed in my classes and how things that we cover in class will end up informing what I do at work. So in my case, because everything's happening in the museum, everything's very hands-on, it was very easy to have that crossover between classes and work.
Okay. And right now, like I know you just graduated, but are you thinking going into industry more, or do you think you want to come back for more education?
Again, if I can help it, I'd rather not get a PhD, which is sometimes kind of hard for, I think, faculty and professors to hear, because I think the base assumption in a lot of academia is just that you're here to get as high a degree as you can, right? You go for your PhD, go for that terminal degree, and then you're just going to stick around in academia. You're going to become a professor and start your own lab and so on. So the Museum Studies program in that way is kind of unique, where it's training people for what's basically industry. A lot of museums are nonprofit, but all that to say, like, they're training people to not go into academia for the most part. Now there are university museums, but the vast majority of people who go to work in museums are not going to be working on campuses. So to have my advisors, kind of suggest like, oh, you're going to want to publish that in case you want a PhD, in case you want to go on, with the full knowledge that like, I would rather not get a PhD. I would rather just get a job in a museum and call it a day.
Fair.
So
fair enough. And now for, kids coming in, like, how would you suggest they start a career or start their education in entomology?
Oh, for entomology in particular, if you can get involved in research, either as an undergraduate or a graduate. When I was an undergraduate, I knew I wanted to be involved with insects in any way possible, and for me that looked like undergraduate research. But if you can volunteer in an entomology collection, if you can, even just visiting, museums, I think is a good thing for entomology. But yeah, entomology is tricky because there's not a lot you can do with just a bachelor's in entomology.
Fair.
And so maybe if you're going into it, maybe just keep that in mind. Maybe you can do a little bit more if you're going to an institution that has a department of entomology in particular. Like I know University of Florida, I think, has a dedicated entomology department. So if you get your bachelor's in entomology, that's one thing. The institution I went to, University of Montana, did not have a dedicated entomology program. So I had to get my Bachelor of Biology with the full knowledge that I would have to go on and get a master's in entomology or a master's in something else focused on entomology. So if you're going into entomology, for the most part, you're going to have to, just be aware of how much school you're signing yourself up for. But again, I guess that depends also on what your end goal is, because if you want to go into entomology for research purposes or for joining a museum or becoming an academic, it will involve a lot more schooling. But if you are getting into entomology just because you want to become an exterminator and you want to kill all the insects, then maybe then a bachelor's is enough, and then some knowledge of like how chemicals affect insects. So I guess keep in mind how much schooling you're signing yourself up for, and part of that will depend on what your end goals are. So are you going into entomology for research purposes, or are you going into entomology for other reasons like agriculture or like extermination?
Yeah. So that's so interesting how like there's so many different paths, and your path specifically was in biology, but I guess trying to stay relevant could be a way, right? Like biology is sort of relevant, right? It is really relevant towards the entomology there, because it goes hand in hand. But do you think if somebody chose a different major, it would hurt them before going into like a master's for entomology?
I guess, it just depends on what your angle is. So if biology is kind of a no-brainer. Ecology would be another good way to have sort of a relevant degree that's close to entomology. So ecology, a lot of entomology studies are based on insect interactions with plants. So plant-insect interactions, that's part and parcel of ecology.
What if somebody was just like, I want to major in music. Like I want to play rock. I want to play rock and roll, right? And then they have an epiphany, and they're like, you know what? I want to work with bugs. I want to work with insects. Is that okay? Like, does the field reward people for being diverse, in their backgrounds? Or do they prefer more like targeted pathways?
I think because entomology is a study of the natural world, I think you will be better served by biology or ecology or natural history degrees. Now, that's not to say that there's other paths. So I know if you are like an anthropologist and you suddenly realize you have a passion for insects, that's fine. In our entomology library at the museum, I found a paper one time that was like an anthropological perspective on insects from the Navajo. So this whole paper was just like, here's all the different Navajo words for these different insects and the different insects that they correlate to in our sort of modern like scientific Latin terms. So here's the anthropological perspective of these people who've known these insects for forever because they live in that land, versus what we know sort of as modern ecologists and our perspective and kind of putting those two things together. So there's ways to come in from an outside perspective. You just got to be mindful of it. So for instance, if you like are a music major, I still think there might be a way for you to sort of get your way in there. A lot of insects make music. A lot of, crickets and grasshoppers and all the rest. They'll make, maybe not music, but they'll make noise. They'll make noise for mating calls. And so there's a lot of sort of morphological and biological research being done on like how do they make those noises, what distinguishes one species from another. Sometimes it is just the different noises that they make, the different mating calls that they make. So entomology is primarily a biological, ecological sort of field, but I think if you're intentional about it, I think you can find other angles too.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's reassuring to hear that.
Yes.
It's not like I want to be a doctor or something and I need to go down all these routes and have all these internships in order to be that doctor, right? You can sort of switch and change around and kind of go based on your passions and your interest, and hopefully you can still, with all the right certifications and
fingers crossed,
the right degree, that they'll still have you. That's good to hear that it's not so strict.
Entomology, and it depends on how you define that too, because entomology can be fairly broad, and we usually think of it in terms of the natural history sense of just studying the insects themselves. But if you wanted to be a doctor and then had a passion for insects, there's still a way, because there's parasitology or like medical entomology. That's a field too, because insects are so involved in our daily lives in so many different ways. That means that there are other angles besides just the natural sciences route. So parasitology, there's forensic entomology if you're like a forensics type of person. There's forensic entomology. There's all sorts of paths in there.
That's interesting. Medical
entomology, yes. Yeah. So
what is that
about? It's closely related to parasitology. So this is primarily a problem in the tropics where the insects can be especially gnarly. But if you get infected by an insect, or maybe you're trying to figure out ways to keep insects at bay so that they don't infect us. So the most dangerous animal on the planet is the mosquito, because it carries malaria and it carries all these diseases, and it kills so many people per year. So people think of sharks or bears or I don't know what in terms of dangerous animals, but the most dangerous animal in terms of number of deaths per year is the mosquito. And so there you go. That's entomology still. That's medical entomology or disease vectoring or epidemiology, or so there's all these different sort of side fields to it.
Okay, so really it just kind of depends on the angle that you want to go at it from, and that you can still do it, right? Awesome. Have you heard about the wolves in Colorado, how they're planning to introduce wolves?
You mean reintroduced?
Reintroduced.
I don't think I'd heard all that much, but
and obviously there was a ballot and there's a poll, and it's like, should we do it? Should we not do it? And a lot of the farmers and cattle ranchers, they're very much against it, because it's like, this is my livelihood. This is my cattle, my stock that these wolves are most likely going to get, because they're hungry and they're aggressive. And so those are more people that are like on the front line, and people more in the city like we are. We don't really have that picture in our heads here, and like how it can really impact us firsthand. Have you heard about the wolves being reintroduced?
A little bit. I mean, I'd heard about wolf reintroduction into Yellowstone, because I'm from Montana, and so Yellowstone's right next door. So I'd heard a lot about that. I'd only heard a little bit about reintroduction here in Colorado, but I do know that it is a very complicated issue, because there's the biology side of it. Like, okay, maybe once upon a time our ecosystems did have wolves in them, but humans have come in and changed so much about the ecosystem. So at this point we have to ask, like, if we reintroduced wolves, is that going to be sustainable for the wolves? What is that going to do to all the sort of food chain interactions downstream? Is that going to affect agriculture and cattle and sheep and so on? How's that going to affect? I mean, there's so many different things that affects, and you need a multidisciplinary approach to not only think about the biology, but to think about the ecology of it and the social issues around it and land use and government policies about wolves, because a lot of times the policies that get made about wolves aren't maybe completely aware about the biology of wolves. So a good example is like, how do you define a wolf? Because sometimes they can hybridize with coyotes, and then, okay, is it a wolf or is it a coyote now? If it's a hybrid, can you apply the same laws to that hybrid as you would a normal wolf? It gets really complicated really fast. So that's where you need all sorts of different kinds of knowledge. And that's true of conservation in general, and particularly true of like invertebrate conservation. So to bring it back to insects, like a lot of conservation laws that are written are focused on large animals like wolves or whatever other large animal stuff with backbones. But a lot of those conservation decisions will affect invertebrates and will affect insects as well. And so you need to have a lot of knowledge from the biological side in order to properly inform those laws and policies. So that's true of insects. That's true of wolves. It's true of conservation in general.
Yeah, because I think the idea was that reintroducing wolves would have a positive effect in their minds. How, it would help the food chain out, but I don't know if that's truly the case or not, like in real practice when you actually introduce them. So
yeah, the answer to most issues and questions in the field of ecology is it's complicated. And so I think this is one of those times where it's like, okay, is introducing wolves a good thing or a bad thing? And in this case, like neither of those options really captures what would happen if you reintroduced a large predator like that. So the real answer is just like, it's complicated. So
sure.
It would be positive in some ways, like if you're trying to maybe you're trying to manage large herbivore populations like elk or deer or whatever else. Well, then maybe wolves are great, but there's always going to be downstream effects. There's going to be other problems that maybe you can't even foresee right now. And so the answer is never going to be like it's 100% a good thing or it's 100% a bad thing. When it comes to nature and when it comes to ecology, the answer is almost always it's complicated.
Yeah. In ecology, is there like sort of like a similar parallel to wolves, like something introduced in the ecological world that's like a big debate, whether it's like, oh, we shouldn't put this insect here because it'll eat all the other insects or something like that.
Oh, so
does that exist?
Yeah, in certain ways. So like especially as pertains to insects, there's always a big conversation around invasive species. So sometimes you'll introduce a species to an area and it doesn't take hold and it just dies out. All those whatever animals that you introduce, they just die out. But sometimes if you introduce an animal or a plant, it can really take root in this new habitat and it can outcompete the other species in this habitat and really become a problem. And so now that's what a lot of sort of modern ecology is focused on, is like keeping in mind invasive species and trying to keep habitats as natural as possible, like as they looked like currently or 200 years ago or 400 years ago or whatever. And so there's always a big focus on keeping invasive species to a minimum. But it gets complicated because sometimes you'll have a plant that was introduced 100 years ago and has become invasive. But one of the solutions to that is to introduce an insect from that plant's native habitat that would like eat the plant and help keep that plant at bay. So you've already got an introduced plant. Now the question is, should you also on purpose introduce this insect in order to eat the plant? And there's so many different policies and steps you have to go through to make sure that the insect will stay on that plant and won't like jump hosts and start eating other plants. And for the most part, we've done okay with introducing these insects to eat the weeds and invasive plants. But once in a while we get it wrong. And so recently I know there was an issue where I think the USDA introduced an insect to keep a certain plant at bay. And then that insect just decided it didn't want to eat that plant and started eating all the other plants in the habitat as well. And it became its own problem. So always there's a conversation around, especially around invasive insects. and how they, especially in terms of biocontrol, that's what it's called when you introduce it to keep a certain plant at bay.
Yeah, I would imagine it's so difficult, like in a big national park, to get the ecosystem right, to create an ecosystem, just so everybody can sort of cohabitate and not one predator eats everything else, just having that equal balance, right? And especially now in an ecology world, it's much smaller scale, right? And now you have to make sure it's a small scale in terms of maybe like the size of the animal, but it's a large scale in terms
it's always
of like,
large.
It's the landscape. It's the entire landscape. It's that is the environment. It's the ecology, right?
Yeah, conservation in national parks especially is tricky because, it's like what is your end goal? Are you trying to make the park just like pretty for visitors? Are you trying to keep the park as a stable ecosystem? But okay, then what type of ecosystem? Is it the one that exists now? Or I know a lot of ecologists want to make Yellowstone look like it did maybe 300 years ago before white settlers came in and changed everything. And so their sort of baseline assumption is that we should make the national park as close as possible look like it did, 1,000 years ago or whatever. But that gets tricky too, because 1,000 years ago, there were people living in Yellowstone National Park. There were native peoples who called that their home. And so really, as soon as you sort of mark out a national park and say, okay, we want it to be like quote unquote pristine. Okay, what does that look like? What do you mean when you say that? Because, when Yellowstone National Park was originally founded, I think they had to like remove some native folks who had called that their home, but they wanted it to be quote unquote pristine. They wanted there to be no humans. So in terms of what ecosystem and what you want a national park to look like, that ends up being actually really complicated and really that could be its own whole podcast just about national park resource conservation. It gets really complicated. Yeah,
and especially since we've been trafficking so much of these national parks, because we love to go to the national park. At least I know I do, and I know a lot of other folks like to go to national parks and explore them. Like, how do you think human interactions with these national parks can improve?
That's a complicated question, just because, again, like the job of a national park is a complicated one to begin with, because you're setting apart these big areas of land. Like you're encompassing, a large part of an ecosystem in order to, this isn't like a wildlife preserve. Like there's areas in this country that are set aside to be wilderness areas. So there's areas in Idaho and Montana. That's the whole point, is just we mark these out as like, okay, nobody is allowed to settle this, no homes, no roads, nothing. It is meant to be wilderness. That's one thing. National parks aren't that. They're parks. They're meant to be visited. And so then it immediately makes it more complicated, because you want people to visit, but if too many people visit, then is that going to affect the actual or perceived like wildness of the park? If people go to Yellowstone and all they see around them are other people, that maybe makes them not want to visit. So in terms of how we're doing, Yellowstone is also just so big that it gets hard, because people basically need their own cars and whatever else. Yeah. In a smaller national park, you can get away with caravans or shuttles. Like Zion National Park has switched mostly to shuttles. But the way that park is laid out makes it much easier. Yellowstone is just so big that it's hard to do anything except just have people drive through with their own cars. But because Americans love their cars, that means we have to think about, okay, we need to have parking for these cars. We have to have big parking lots in the middle of a national park. That feels weird. That feels like we're spoiling the wildness or something. So, how are we doing in terms of national parks? I don't know. It's complicated. I don't think there's ever going to be an easy answer. I think it'll be kind of a dance in terms of like, okay, that maybe that's too much human interaction. Okay, but we should make things accessible for people who can't hike in on their own, and so on. So it's complicated, and I think it's always going to be complicated.
It's a compromise.
Always, yeah.
Because it's us and nature, and we're trying to get the best experience possible without harming the nature, right? So it's a compromise for sure. Coming from your perspective here, having like an ecological background and studying, outdoors and insects and bugs, what recommendation would you make? Just like start off like off the bat, like is there a recommendation that you suggest when we go to a national park that there's something that we can do to better preserve it or to stop furthering damaging the park?
Stay on the trails. Stay on the trails. That's the number one thing. There's signs all over that say it, and usually it's for different reasons. So I know in Yellowstone when it says stay on the trail, it's because sometimes if you go off the trail, you will fall into a hot pot and like boil yourself alive. So like in those cases, it's for your own best interest. But for a lot of other parks, when they say stay on the trail, sometimes it's because this is like a desert area, and if you tread on the ground, you're disturbing what's called a biocrust on the top of the ground. Mm-hmm. So this is really tiny organisms and lichens and whatever else that have kind of colonized that top layer of soil. And they're necessary for keeping that soil in place. So if enough people walk on this ground and break the biocrust and turn it into loose dirt, if a windstorm comes up, it'll be so much worse than if that biocrust were intact and it would keep all that dust on the ground. Mm. So first and foremost, and again, this is true for your own safety and for the habitat for especially like tiny, organisms, stay on the trail. Mm. Stay on the trail. But then also, I know a lot of people, especially in Montana, will get kind of salty when they see that parks, like Glacier Park recently moved to this reservation system. So this is true also here in Colorado for Rocky Mountain National Park. There's a reservation system. Only so many people are allowed in at one time.
Is that still a thing now?
At Rocky Mountain? Yeah.
Yeah. Because that was for the pandemic, right?
But I think they're holding on to it. Yeah.
Okay.
And it's because if, it's a way to manage traffic. So it comes down to like how many people are in the park at one time. Mm. So if it's in the middle of the summer, middle of the day, everyone wants to be out there. Well, then if you go into the park, it's going to be busy, and you go into the middle of the park and you're just going to look around and just see other people. Mm. And so I think parks have sort of gotten wise to that, and they're thinking about, okay, can we sort of regulate how many people are in the park at one time? And that's what that reservation system is for. So that's been going on at Rocky Mountain, and Glacier National Park in Montana has also recently instituted that. Mm. And so that system is there for a reason, and I know people can be salty about it and like, that means just like it's the people who can afford to like make a reservation way ahead of time. But anyway, if I remember, like there's no cost to making a reservation. Mm. You just have to be on it and just log on and when reservations open. So there's no sort of money barrier in that way. But yeah, stay on the trail and recognize that reservation systems, even if they're annoying sometimes, they're there for a reason. I think those are kind of the two that come to my mind.
Yeah, I think the reservation like system, I don't know if it was there a lot prior to the pandemic, but but if it is currently offered now and it is in place like a reservation system, like I think that is good just to control the numbers.
Yeah.
Especially during the pandemic, when it's like there's nothing else to do. Right. And it's like, hey, let's all go, right? Yeah. And then that's really overwhelming. Because folks like some people really care about the outdoors because they, lived and grew up in it and whatever. But some people don't. Some people don't care. They just go out and do whatever and litter and, how do we use the bathroom when we're out backpacking, etc. It's like, what are the precautions there? They don't care, right?
Yeah, so that's, again, another layer of complexity to the national park issue is that, yes, we want people to visit. Okay, but who's going to visit? It's going to be all sorts of different kinds of people with different mindsets and different, levels of understanding. So it's going to be, the people who know this land and love it, and they want to come and visit and see the wildlife that they know is there. Yeah. It's also going to be tourists who are coming from far away who just want to see the cool animals. Mm-hmm. And then that gets into like science communication and museum education too, because there'll be visitor centers in those parks, and it's the visitor center exhibits job to like educate the public, and there's usually, you know, rangers that will also be there to educate people. So again, there's it's complicated, and who visits parks, it's always going to be an ongoing conversation, because you want people to visit, you want people to learn, especially about what's there, even if their base level understanding is not great. Because I'm thinking of one of my favorite questions about Yellowstone is like someone who visited and asked the ranger, he's like, hey, at what elevation do the deer become elk? And the ranger had like, look at them like, what do you mean? Like, yeah, there's deer and then there's elk. Like, at what elevation do they become elk? And so I'm sure that ranger had to like spell it out, like, no, those are two different, like deer, there's a species of deer and then there's some species of elk. So again, another layer of complexity, who visits, what's their mindset? Yeah. We can only hope then that as people visit, that, you know, the rangers and so on can educate people, and that people, through seeing the park and through hearing from rangers, that they can change their mindset or develop their mindset further. It's complicated.
Yeah. What do you think about people that just go into the park and, you know, when you go into a park and you see there's like 1,000 people beside you, right, as they're in there, and you just want to enjoy this nature, and you know, people with their selfie sticks out and they're taking pictures of themselves, and, you know, maybe they're feeding the animals too, you know.
Oh no, yeah. So this gets back to, I grew up in Montana, so there's some part of me that's always just gonna be irked by like, oh, these out-of-staters are coming in and just to like gawk at our wildlife or whatever. But no, again, that's the point of national parks, is for people to visit. Don't feed the animals. That one's almost, you know, the consequences are going to be their own punishment, because especially if you're feeding, there's always a report, at least once a year, of a tourist getting head-butted by a bison, by a buffalo. Yeah. Because they want to feed it. Oh, it's so cute, I just want to go up and pet it. Well, no, that's a wild animal. It's going to headbutt you. So there's always a report, at least once a year, of someone getting headbutted by a buffalo. So that one's just sort of self-fulfilling. But yeah, when I see tons and tons of people, I mean, sometimes it's because they're stopped for something that is actually cool. Yeah. So I don't know how many times we've been driving along in Yellowstone, and then there's a big group of cars, and it's like, okay, wait, are they stopped for just another buffalo, or is it something cool? And sometimes it'll be like, oh, everyone's stopped because there's a group of wolves in the meadow, you know, just nearby. That's cool. You know, people then are stopping and gawking for a reasonable reason, for like a good reason to see these really cool animals. But yeah, there's always going to be some small part of me that sees the crowds and crowds of tourists, and it's just like, oh no, what are all these people doing here? Yeah. Besides the fact that I am a tourist, like when I'm in those parks, I am also being a tourist, and so I can't point fingers too much without pointing fingers at myself, because in that moment I am also visiting the park in my own car, you know, whatever. I'm contributing to the mess of tourists.
In Yellowstone too, a lot of people stop because, like you said, there's bison in the middle of the road or something. Yeah. But then the hard part or the challenging part is when they get out of the car and they're like, okay, well, now I can get a picture with this bison, right? You know, maybe these are foreigners from out of the country that they come in, because Yellowstone's a big national park for the U.S., but, you know, they just don't know the etiquette, and then they're like, oh, it won't hurt me, right? It's all good.
Yeah, and again, always reports of someone getting headbutted. But I think part of that might also be because maybe it's just because we call it a park. You know what I mean? Like if you go to a park, you expect it to be that all of it should be like a friendly space, right? You go to a city park, this is just going to be like grass and sunshine, you can fly your kite, whatever, it should be friendly. You go to a national park, sure, it's bigger, but I think sometimes people might have the expectation that, well, it's a park, right? Everything should be fine. And yeah, they don't realize, like, no, these are wild animals that are here. So again, comes down to the visitor centers and the rangers, whose job it is to like make sure people understand, like, don't feed the buffalo or else you're gonna get headbutted. You know.
Yeah. I remember this one time when we went to Yellowstone. We stopped by. It was early morning too. It was the last day, and all week we've been wanting to spy a bear. We've been wanting to spot a bear, and the second to last day we spot black bear and their cub, but not for long. It was not long because they're very skittish. We found out.
Yes, black bears. Yeah.
Especially when they have their cub with them, they want to be really
Yep.
protective.
Yeah.
And so we just saw them turn their heads for about a second or two, and then they're gone. Because there was such a big line in front of us too. They're all looking at the same thing, and we couldn't park our car in time to go see it, so we saw them for a short time. So we're like, we kind of got to see a bear, not really though. And then the last day in the morning, we saw a grizzly bear.
Ooh, yeah.
And so early morning, not many people out. People are still sleeping in their tents and whatnot. And then we're like, we see this park ranger stop their car there. And we're like, now I know that's a good sign. If a park ranger's there, it's like there's probably something interesting there that they want to keep you from.
Yeah.
Not just like your normal horde of people in their cars, right? Because that could be. I mean, there's still epic animals like elk and moose, of course, but rare like a bear. Okay, it warrants a park ranger because it could, get really aggressive all of a sudden, right? Especially this grizzly bear. And just attack people. But yeah, we saw this 500-pound like grizzly bear early in the morning on the last day, and we're like, oh my gosh, what an opportunity. We were there for like a week too, and we didn't get to see anything, and it was like last moment we're like, wow, that's a majestic grizzly bear.
Yeah.
So I know that we don't have much grizzly bears in Colorado, but are there a lot of grizzly bears in Montana?
Yeah, in terms of like where grizzly bears are living in the lower 48, I know a lot of them are still sort of residing in Montana, and they tend to be in those areas that are either designated as wilderness areas or close to wilderness areas. So in Montana, that would be the Bob Marshall Wilderness area, but then that goes down, and I know there's a stretch of land between that wilderness area and Yellowstone where the grizzly bears will go back and forth. And then, some grizzly bears that live in Yellowstone. Yeah. So Montana has some grizzlies. I think Idaho has some, but they tend to be sort of in those areas where they're undisturbed.
They just don't care. Those grizzly bears, they just don't care. We were right next to it, and we were really close to it, next to the car, and they just continued grazing. In comparison to the black bears that were a lot more skittish.
They're skittish, yeah.
The grizzly bear just continued on its way and it's just eating and like normal.
Just knows that it's big enough not to be disturbed.
It knows.
What time of year were you there?
I think this was summertime.
Okay.
Summertime.
Okay, so that's the other thing about bears is just that when you're hibernating, they're just subsisting on whatever body fat that they have. But that means that for the rest of the year, when it's actually warm, it is their job just to rebuild all of that body fat and just to bulk up again. And so really, I think the main thing on that grizzly bear's mind is just eating. And so again, as long as you're not provoking it, the summertime is a great time. I mean, that's the prime time to get all the good food. And so I'm sure its primary concern was just eating.
The grizzly bear is so confident, right? Because I think in its mind, it knows it can take you. It knows that it's pretty sturdy. Why are black bears so skittish?
I don't know. I think it is that they're smaller.
That's interesting.
But I've run into that too. Yeah, the black bears are the skittish ones.
Because I know they're a little bit smaller, and I don't know. Maybe people have hurt them or something in the past, but. I don't know. They're relatively big too, though. Still,
that's the thing in terms of like the animals that we run into on a daily basis. Yeah, but black bear is still a large animal.
Yeah.
But compared to other animals that are maybe out in the wilderness, they're not as big. I don't know why their personalities are different.
That's interesting. Yeah, because the grizzly bear was definitely a big fella there. He was around 500 pounds. These black bears, I think, maybe like half the weight or something.
I'm sure. Yeah.
National parks are amazing places, and definitely should keep them preserved as long as possible. And you said they're trying, like a big goal of them is to keep them like they were many years ago. So that's like a complicated thing. Okay, here we go. So a lot of people's, and especially a lot of ecologists, sort of baseline assumption is that if you want to keep an area wild, quote unquote wild, that there should be some baseline that you're shooting towards.
So most often what that means, especially here in the American West, is that it should look like it did, before white people came and cleared everything out. And so, again, that calls into question, like, okay, what do you mean when you say that it should look like that? Because then that means that there should be native folks who've lived here for thousands of years and call it their home and who have been tending to the land. If you clear them out of that land, it no longer looks like it did 1,000 years ago. So what do you really mean when you say it should look like it did, back in time? So there's always a question about, what should a national park ecosystem look like? What should a wild area look like? And it's a question of baselines and what you're aiming for. And I think more recently there's been more conversation about just that we can make these ecosystems look how we want them to. They don't have to look any one way. A national park, even though it's considered wild, that's still like an engineered ecosystem. People don't like to think about it that way, but we marked it out as a park. We have park rangers whose job it is to introduce animals or maybe cull some of the elk if there's too many of them, right? We're still fiddling in the ecosystem even when we call it wild. So if you want more on that question about what a national park ecosystem should look like, this book I read recently is fantastic. It's called Rambunctious Garden by Emma Marris, Marris. So Rambunctious Garden, Saving Nature in a Post-Wild World. So her point is just that, like, there's not that many spaces on Earth that are left that we would think of as wild. Like, humans have been here for so long, and we've done crazy things to the environment and removed animals and introduced new ones, and like nothing is pristine anymore, like we would usually think of as pristine. So we should just admit it and like move on and think about, okay, well, if it can't be pristine, quote unquote pristine, well then what should a wild space look like, or what should a national park look like? Because that's a choice that we make as ecologists and as conservationists. So yeah, ecologists usually like to have a baseline to aim for in terms of what a habitat should look like. What that baseline is kind of up to them, and that's a complicated choice.
Yeah, because to me, sort of that theoretical way is like without human, right?
Yeah, that's what a lot of modern Americans think. Yeah,
it's like whether it's 10 years ago, 100 years ago, 1,000 years ago, like that's your goal. I think ultimately the goal is without human intervention, what does it look like? And that's what they're striving for.
Typical,
but yeah. Unfortunately, we're here. Yep, we're here as humans, and we interact. And so now, like you said, come to terms with it, and how can we proceed from here and keep it as pristine as possible? Yeah.
And that is the typical thing that people think of. Is like, oh, if we want it wild, that means without humans. But yeah, if you wanted a space here in the American West that, if that's your baseline, okay, without humans, we should make it look like back when there were no humans. Okay, that's 12,000 years ago. That raises the question, okay, should we introduce animals that were here during the Ice Age? Because that's what you're getting at. Like, if you want an environment that looked like it did back when there were no humans, that's what it looked like. Okay, are you going to reverse engineer an elephant into a woolly mammoth and reintroduce it? Are you going to reintroduce large predators like saber-toothed cats? Like, horses evolved here in North America. Are you going to like figure out a way to, do you want wild horses in your national parks then? And most people would say no, because these days horses are seen as human, like they're domesticated. So yeah, to be without humans, that's kind of the baseline, but that's a tricky, it feels like the go-to. That feels like the typical thing to shoot for. Yeah. But even that's complicated.
Yeah. Complicated.
It's always
complicated is a key word there.
Yes. Yes.
Oh man, is there anything that you want to talk about? Any topics that you're interested in? I know I've been asking all the questions.
Geez. Yeah, if you're gonna set me loose to talk about insects, I'll talk about them all day.
Go for it. Anything you want to talk about?
Talk about bugs. Talk about museums. Actually, here's the thing. A little bit about museums too, because I think when you visit a museum, what you see is just the exhibits. You're not seeing the collections behind the scenes. So again, last weekend I graduated, and so my family came and visited, and I got to show my grandma and my grandpa the insect collection. And so I showed them some of a drawer of wasps that were part of the project that I worked on for my thesis.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was just a whole drawer. It was just a whole drawer, like hundreds of insects, all of one species. Like we had caught a bunch of different species, but it just so happened all the ones of this one species we put in one drawer. So it's hundreds and hundreds of Isodontia mexicana. It was a bunch of grass wasps. And my grandma saw all of those bugs of the same species. And she was like, why did you collect so many of the same species? So this is a question for natural history museums. Like why should we continue to collect? If we already have an example of that species in the museum, why should we continue to collect? And so I got to explain to her, like, well, okay, here's why natural history museums collect. If you just have one specimen of that one species and it was collected at a certain place at a certain time, okay, but now maybe you're interested in, like, okay, are the ones further up in elevation, are they bigger? Maybe their body sizes are bigger. Well, you can't answer that question if you only have one specimen of that species. So that's why we need to collect, like, from a broad geographic range so that we can answer those questions. Like, okay, well, the bugs down here at lower elevation are a different body size than the one at higher elevation. And then you can start to answer those questions. So that's why you have to collect not just from one area over and over, but you have to collect from a broad geographic area, ideally. But then also, even if let's say you've collected across the entire state for a year, and then you stop collecting, well, then that means you can't answer other questions. So if you're asking, like, okay, well, these years maybe were wetter years than the dry years. Okay, how did that affect the insects? Well, you can't answer that unless you've also collected through time. So that's why it's always important for museums to keep collecting. So even though it seems like, okay, we already have hundreds of this one species of insect from all over the country, but we still need to collect so that we can answer these questions about, okay, how does wet years versus dry years affect it? How does different habitat changes affect it? Right? And that only is going to get more important as climate change gets worse, and we can answer questions about, okay, how is climate change affecting this species or that species? Yeah. So I think a lot of people see that museums have collected dozens or hundreds of specimens and then ask, like, well, why do you need more? Well, it's so that we can answer all sorts of different kinds of questions that we wouldn't be able to answer otherwise. So it is important that museums keep collecting. And I also do want to assure anyone listening who's concerned about, like, collectors going out and just capturing all of one species and driving it to extinction. For the most part, that doesn't happen, especially for insects. Like, there's just so many insects out there that collecting a few every year doesn't make a big dent. Now, that gets different if it's an endangered species. That's why we have permits in place, so you can only collect a certain number per year per place. And that can be important for endangered and rare species. So museums, that's why museums collect, why we have so many from different places and so many times. And that's why it's important that we still collect, even though it seems like we already have enough. Like, if we want to keep doing good research, we do need to keep collecting.
And so you're saying it's like, because it's an evolving world and it changes every day, that you keep collecting so you can see how it impacts as we're evolving, as we're changing day to day.
Yeah.
I know you said climate change there, and I know where we are currently, we're very concerned about climate change in Colorado here. What is your take on climate change?
Well, it's definitely happening, and that's definitely going to get worse. And Colorado is going to feel that keenly. And I mean, you turn on NPR and they're always talking about, well, the Colorado River is drying up, and okay, how do we share water in a world that's, continuing to dry up here in the American West? And so it's already happening. We've witnessed it happening in museum collections. Like, insects are changing where they live and when they emerge because of warming climates. So yeah, it's happening. It's only going to get worse, which is kind of a bummer. But again, if collectively we take action, we can mitigate it. But things will get warmer.
Okay. Yeah. Obviously, there's two sides to it, and people want to debate on climate change because it's just such a hot topic, right?
Well, yeah, and especially in America, it has become a whole issue besides itself.
Yeah.
Like it's not just about like, oh, climate change and what causes it and what or its effects, but then it becomes a political thing about now there's these political parties have different ideas about it, and it's like, oh, so it was just one issue, but now it's become a whole other set of issues because it's made its way into politics.
One side is like sounding the alarms, or like, oh my gosh, like we have to do something very quick, take action.
Yes.
And then the other side is like, it's okay. I think I think like there's always gonna, like, you have to have human interaction with the environment, right? But like I guess my question for you is like, what is the scale, do you think? Like, like, what is the severity essentially? Like, is it really severe in your opinion, or is it like, oh, just a little bit?
So actually, and there's kind of two things there, because talking about like there has to be human interaction with the environment, like that we are a part of nature.
Yeah.
Like that is true. That's like an extension of the national park conversation, right? It's just that, we're living here. We can't kind of go back on that, and we all have to continue to live here. So it just becomes a question of how. So a matter of lifestyle. So in America, we enjoy our cars. We enjoy using a lot of water. We enjoy eating red meat, which is especially expensive energetically and in terms of water and feed and all the rest. And so, it's just an extension of that conversation. We are going to have to figure out how. It's not a matter of can we interact with the environment or not. Like we will have to interact with the environment. That's just how it is. But it's a matter of how and how much, and can we mitigate our effect here while still living in a certain way. So it is going to be a question of how. In terms of how severe, again, I'm not a climate scientist, but I've a lot of biological research these days is focused on climate change and how it's affecting different species across the globe. And so really, in terms of how bad it gets, my main thought is just it depends on the scale that you're looking at. So if you look at one species of bumblebee, maybe, and you say, how bad is climate change going to be for this species? Well, it could be absolutely catastrophic. Like that bumblebee species might be, like several have already gone extinct in the past 20 years. And almost surely like more will go extinct in the next couple of years. So if you look at the scale of just like species, it's going to be not good for a lot of species. A lot of species are going extinct and will go extinct in the future. But if you zoom out a little bit and just think about ecosystems, on the whole, like how's Colorado going to do? Well, I mean, on the other side of, whatever happens in the next 100, 200 years, there will still be a Colorado ecosystem. It might look a little different, things will change, but there'll still be an ecosystem. So in that sense, like things will be fine. And same if you look at sort of a large taxonomic spread. So if you ask, how are certain species going to do? Well, some are definitely going to go extinct. But if you ask like, okay, how are insects on the whole going to do? Well, yeah, some species are going to go extinct, but some will survive. So like on the whole, insects as a whole are going to be fine. Now that's just because insects are small and so numerous and adaptable to change. Some taxa of organisms might not fare so well. So a good way to think about this is like amphibians, like frogs and newts and salamanders and things. People have asked like, okay, how are amphibians going to do? And that's still an open question actually, because humans have like changed their habitat so much that they're not able to adapt fast enough. And so a lot of them, like it's too warm or too dry or whatever. And so species are going extinct. Humans have also made the climate ripe for a certain kind of fungus, chytrid fungus, to like wipe out a lot of amphibian species. So, or even if it doesn't wipe out an entire species, the absolute number of frogs that are out in the wild is still lower than it was 100 years ago, just because they've been getting wiped out by diseases. So at the moment, I think there's some big questions about like, okay, how are mammals on the whole going to do? Well, they'll be fine. There will be mammals in 100,000 years. Okay, what about insects? There's definitely going to be, they've been around for hundreds of millions of years. They'll be around in 100,000 years. Well, what about amphibians? And that's kind of an open question still about like, well, they're doing okay right now, but they're not doing great. And so there's some species that, are generalists, as in like they can live anywhere, and they'll probably be okay for a bit, but a lot of species are very sensitive to their habitat and levels of wetness and temperature and so on. And so there's been a lot of amphibian species that have gone extinct. So how bad will it get in terms of species? Some will definitely go extinct. How bad will it be in terms of, broad taxonomic ranges? Well, everything, stuff's going to survive, and it'll look different in 100,000 years, but it'll be, the stuff will survive. I think when people ask, like, how bad is it going to be? How bad is climate change going to be? What they really mean is like, okay, what about the human toll of climate change? And that is also an open question, because it is up to us in terms of like, will we make the choices to mitigate some of these effects of climate change? And what gets tricky is that a lot of sort of the brunt of climate change is not going to be felt by us in America because we're relatively rich globally. We have the resources to deal with climate change. If we in Colorado, it's too dry here, we're just going to move away, we have the resources to do that. Or we have the resources to change, okay, we can let more water out of the Colorado River at certain times or whatever. We have, the brunt of the effects of climate change are going to be felt not by like the rich folks globally, but by the global poor. So already sea levels have risen. And so there's places like Bangladesh that are very close to sea level, where now there's seawater rising up into the river systems and into the swamps and into the habitats and farmland and so on. And so they, besides the fact that Bangladesh is having political trouble, but that's another issue. They're not, Bangladesh, the Maldives are close to sea level, right? They are dealing with it like right now, and they don't necessarily have the resources to deal with it. They can't just, I'm just going to up and move to the higher ground. It's like, no, this is where my family's lived for 5 generations. I'm not just going to,
uproot.
I can't just uproot. Besides the fact that even if they wanted to, they might not have the financial or logistic resources to do so. So that, and if it gets too much warmer, there's certain places in like the Arabian Peninsula and India that, combined with the humidity, like they will just be uninhabitable because the human body can't get rid of enough heat. It'll just be too hot to live there. Like there will be certain stretches of Earth that are uninhabitable to humans if we let it go too far. So yeah, and that is another, it's complicated question, because it is that one is still up to us. I mean, certain things, for certain species or for certain ecosystems might have already passed a tipping point, but on the whole, like thinking globally, to this big issue at large, it is still up to us, and we have to think about what are we willing to do, and how can we change our lifestyle to ensure that like climate change is mitigated and that Earth is still habitable for the most number of people in the most number of places in 100 or 200 years time. So, and that gets tricky, because trying to convince someone, hey, you should change your actions, not based on what you're going to benefit from in a week's time, but trying to tell them, hey, you should change your behavior so that someone in 100 years on the other side of the globe will be able to live. Like, even though that's a noble and good thing, that's a harder pitch, just because it's so removed from our everyday lives. So anyway, that was a lot about climate change, but that's because it's a big issue, and it's got its fingers in every other issue that we're dealing with now. And so in terms of how bad it'll be, it does depend on scale, but then it really does depend on like how much we're willing to take on that problem and take it seriously and change our actions.
For sure. I think it's not helpful to be on either extremes, right? Like if you're such a huge climate activist and you're trying to shove it down people's throat, like it's just about the delivery, and maybe people won't take that too well, even though it could be because your intentions are still good, right?
Yeah,
obviously.
But the vehicle, how you deliver at that point that's the important part. And
then the other side obviously is like, oh, it's negligible, right?
No problem.
No
Let's
big
keep
problem.
Drilling,
that's not good either. But I think ultimately it's like you said, like we have a part to play in it, and so we should do our best, right? We should do our best to keep it clean and operable for the next generations and people around the globe, maybe that you don't even see on a day-to-day basis. So yeah, for sure. Yeah. That's a big topic, obviously, and then there's no like simple solution to it.
Yeah, there's no
like
single
overnight
solution. Yeah, nothing. It's not going to be quick, and it's not going to be easy.
Yeah.
So it'll be choices. I mean, individuals can do some stuff, you know, like don't eat as much red meat because that is very expensive, but it'll just take time, and it'll take collective effort is the other thing. The way I think of it is just it took a collective human effort to get us into this problem. We all wanted quick, easy fuel, fossil fuels, and so we dug them up and burned them, and well, now we added some CO2 and other stuff to the atmosphere. But if it was by collective human effort that we got ourselves into this problem, it's not going to be by like little individual choices that we get ourselves out of it. It's going to have to be a collective human effort to get us back out of it. And collective human efforts take time and energy and are very complicated in their own right. So
a lot of money
and
a lot of funding involved too.
Yeah.
You know, when you say red meat, like for you, do you personally like consume meat products?
I do. So here's the deal though. When it comes to red meat, if it's grown in a feedlot on a farm, you know, that usually takes a lot of water and a lot of feed. So this is for cows, pigs, chickens. Chickens are usually a little more efficient. But I'm lucky in that I grew up in Montana, and so my family would just go hunting. And so that is an incredibly efficient way to do it, because that deer, that elk, has just been living off the land its whole life. Right. And then you come in and hopefully you do well and just shoot it real quick, take it home, process it, and then you have red meat at home that has like a really minimal environmental impact. And that's great. Now, obviously, everybody can't do that. We can't all just like hunt animals. There's just too many of us on the landscape now. And so we have to do some sort of farming. And so, yeah, when I say red meat, that's like cows and pigs and large mammals and so on. But you can get your protein other ways. So I mentioned like chickens are a little more efficient. You know, their sort of feed to body mass conversion ratio is what we usually think of. So how much do they have to eat in order to put on a pound of muscle that we would, eat later? Chickens are usually a little more efficient. Fish are really efficient because they're cold blood organisms. But then what's one of the most efficient organisms in terms of feed to mass ratio is actually insects. So this comes back to it. Like a lot of people are pushing now to farm insects for human consumption. So you have to feed them just minimal amounts of food. They can eat food that a cow or a pig couldn't eat. So parts of a plant that they couldn't digest. Yeah. And then...
But now you're trying to convince like the average American to start eating insects.
That's just it. That's just it. And that's the real uphill battle, because we know how to farm insects. We have the technology. We have all that instituted already. It really becomes like, okay, how do you convince the average American to eat whole insects? And usually what it comes down to is like, well, it'll take a long time. Yeah. I've done my own fair share of presentations to like elementary schools. For kids, I was going to say for kids,
like, how do you market to kids?
Oh, you'd be surprised. When I was in high school, I gave a presentation to my school, and this was like K through 6. And I think I did a second presentation that was 7 through 12. So anyway, I gave this presentation to the whole gamut, the whole age range, K through 12. The ones who were the most eager to eat the example insects that I had bought for this occasion were the little kids. They didn't mind at all. It was the older kid. By the time we got to 5th or 6th grade, it was the older kids who had problems with it. And I think it's because...
What did you have for them?
Oh, I had... what did I buy? You can buy edible insects online. So I think I had some mealworms maybe and some flavored bugs. Maybe I had some beetles. I don't remember. And crickets. Usually crickets are the go-to.
Did you prepare them in any way, or did you just raw out of the bag, or did you fry them?
What the company does that had sold them is they'll cook them beforehand. You always cook them beforehand.
Okay. How do they cook them?
Either fry them up, or I don't know if you can boil them, but usually they fry them up, and they'll fry them up with spices. Okay. So they're not plain. They're like any other food. You get them spiced up, and then they would put those in a bag that you could buy. And so that's what I was doing. I had them from a bag, and they'd already been pre-cooked and pre-flavored and all that sort of stuff. Handing them out to the kids to try. And so, yeah, no, it was the little kids who were totally down to do it. And it was the older kids. It was you you get to middle school.
Yeah.
And they were the ones who were having reservations about it, about like, oh, I don't know if I should. And I think it's just our culture and the way that we tell our kids, oh no, bugs are gross. Don't eat the bug.
Yeah.
Don't do that. And it's just, other cultures don't have problems with that because they eat bugs on a regular basis.
Right.
But here in America, bugs are gross. Bugs are pests. Don't touch the bug. Don't be near the bug. And so already at that point, they were like, no, I don't want to eat the bugs. But the little kids were totally down for it. So you'd be surprised. I mean, in terms of who's willing to eat a bug and who's, not willing to eat a bug. But in order to shift it sort of on a cultural level, that's going to take a long time. For sure. And a lot of convincing. And, you probably aren't going to start with a whole bug.
Yeah.
Because that's a lot to be like, I'm eating the whole animal. That's a lot to process. So what a lot of people do these days is just to like grind up the insect into like insect flour. So you'll have like cricket flour is the most common one.
Okay.
You'll grow crickets and then grind them up into flour, and then you can basically hide them in other foods, right? You can make cookies that are using cricket flour. And it doesn't even look like you're eating crickets.
That would be a hit. The next Christmas party you go to.
Yeah, let's go. Oh my goodness, Maggie is so nervous about that. One day I'm going to make cookies, and they're going to have like cricket flour in them or something. But like, no. Anyway, but you'd be surprised. Actually, I made some. This has been a while ago now, but chocolate chip cookies with it was like half normal flour and half cricket flour, and they're actually really tasty because the crickets add sort of a nutty, savory, kind of warm flavor to the cookie. So it's not bad at all. It's actually pretty good. Did
you share it with anybody else?
Yeah. If I remember this, the reason I made the cookies.
Do you pretend?
Oh no, absolutely. Be like, because the other part is like sometimes insects can trigger people's shellfish allergies.
Oh, okay.
Because if you're allergic to shrimp, sometimes it's the exoskeleton that does it, sometimes it's the meat. But sometimes the insects can cause, in rare cases, it can cause allergic reactions. So you always want to be upfront about like these ones have cricket flour in them. But yeah, the reason I made those cookies was for, again, I was in high school. I gave a presentation to some elementary schoolers, and yeah, they loved the cookies.
Nice.
So yeah.
Nice. Yeah. I mean, hey, this is the place to do it. Boulder, Colorado, trying out new healthy foods.
I know.
You could create a business out of it or something.
Yeah. There's already farms that are doing this. There's a farm in Montana called Cowboy Crickets, and they farm crickets for that exact purpose, for making snacks or for making flour. And then of course it's near Bozeman, and Bozeman's very similar to Boulder in terms of like. Everyone's little, kind of granola. They're very environmentally conscious. And so they'd be the first ones that, if you just told them like, oh, yeah, insects are very environmentally friendly in terms of growing them to eat. Oh, they'd try them already.
Yeah. And especially once you get it in powdered form or in flour form, you can put it in you can make pancakes. Yeah. Like you said,
anything
cookies,
you put in normal
bread.
flour.
Yeah. That's a good way to do it, I think, because it's not so like in your face. It's like, like as a kid, it's like, oh, I'm gonna squish this bug and all the bug juices come out, right? It's nothing like that in their head. It's just, now it's a brownie, or like, or now it's a cookie. Like,
exactly.
Yeah, I'll eat that, no problem. Okay, now this new health trend. Okay, like it like fills you. It's good for the environment, and you're not putting so much footprint down. Yeah, it could be a good solution.
Yeah, and that's again convincing Americans to eat whole insects is going to be just too much, especially like right away. So that really is the first place to go. It's just like, nope, you don't even have to see the cricket. It's just ground up, and it's a brownie that's recognizable, or a cookie. You know that. So
yeah. Now, do you have a preference? Do you have a preference to eat it in that format, like in a flour format where it's like kind of hidden away, or do you prefer to like eat whole bugs or insects?
Whole versus ground up. I don't know if I've eaten enough of either to really have a strong opinion. Because there's not many places here in America that even prepare insect dishes where the insects are whole. I do know though at Montana State University, I think they still have it. It's like a bug fair, and they'll serve dishes that have bugs in them, and it's like whole insects. But otherwise, yeah, you're not going to find places that really integrate insects into a dish in their whole form.
Yeah.
You can buy sort of those novelty snacks where they're like flavored mealworms or something, and the bugs are whole in that way. But it's very rare to see here insects that are actually integrated into a larger dish, right? It's not just that you're eating ants. It's like you want to have ants that are mixed with spices and served as a part of a taco or something.
Yeah.
So it's rare to see insects being served that way today. But I do want to try more whole insects because having them ground up is good, but I don't know. If we're gonna eat insects, let's eat insects. I want to try them like with spices and just eat them as they are.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, creativity. Do what you want with it, right? So you have a lot of options there. I just didn't know, like, from a person that studies it, if you consume it is out in person.
Yeah, I'd like to do it more often, but it's not in the mainstream yet, and so you can't just like go to the store and buy
fair enough.
prepared crickets or whatever. If you want to get cricket flour, you usually have to go online and find a specialty vendor. So I would if it was more easily available. Like, right, if I could get bugs in a King Soopers, I would be totally down.
Yeah, that would be fun. Just going down the bug aisle.
Exactly.
Yeah, I want this cricket. I want that spider.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah. No. Definitely, like, outside of the U.S., people are more keen to it. Like with some countries in the Southeast Asia, they'll just eat like a lot of different crickets and like ants and bugs, and they're completely fine. Yeah. And they're healthy. That's the thing.
Yeah,
it's good.
Yeah, and that's another sort of pitching point for insects is that there are a lot of vitamins and minerals that are just inherent in the insect when you eat it. So magnesium, zinc, and I don't know as much about iron. Well, and that's the other thing is like in terms of like the number of big animals that we eat, there's just a few, right? Cattle, pigs,
right,
chickens. I mean, even suggesting that we eat other animals like horses are off the menu for a lot of people. So there's not that many large animals that we eat. But there are so many different kinds of insects, so many different species of insects that are edible. And so if you're trying to suit a certain nutritional need, like you really want iron, I think there are some insects that are more iron rich versus like if you want the insect to taste a certain way, well, then there's an insect for that. And, so there's such a different, there's such a variety in insect cuisine that I think we don't even realize because we haven't even started to do it yet, but there is a huge variety. Yeah.
I would say in my mind, just like having, grown up in the U.S., it's like, well, that's really weird to eat bugs and insects. But, I think we're in a very privileged nation, and it's like we have the opportunity to eat so many different types of animals and a lot of red meat and etc. But I think it's like, if it comes down to it and you need to survive, you'll eat it. Right. For a lot of folks, it's like, I'm not going to turn it away because it looks gross. Right. I'll eat it because I need to survive. Right.
Yeah.
And if you do it, if you think about it in that way, like, well, why not? Right. There's just more marketing that's holding me back, like psychology. So we should definitely look more into consumption of insects and bugs.
Yeah, we should eat more bugs. Yeah, absolutely.
So just graduated once again, and travels are coming up. Hope you have a good time getting to visit Scotland and kind of de-stress a little bit and kind of rejuvenate and come back refreshed and ready to go.
Yeah.
Pleasure having you on.
Thanks for having
coming.
me.
Yeah. Awesome. Cool. That's a wrap.
Yay.